Imagine a man ruling over the most powerful empire of his time. An emperor before whom senators, generals, envoys, and entire peoples stand in reverence. A man who can decide on war and peace, on life and death, on the rise and fall of entire regions. And yet, in quiet hours, this man sits not in front of gold, wine, and signs of triumph, but before simple thoughts about duty, transience, self-control, and humanity. That man was Marcus Aurelius. He was a Roman emperor, general, judge, statesman, and at the same time one of the most famous philosophers in history. To this day, he is considered by many to be the epitome of the wise ruler. But behind this image lies a much harder truth. Marcus Aurelius did not rule in a quiet time. His rule was marked by wars, epidemics, political tensions, family losses, and the constant fear of the disintegration of borders. While he wrote about inner peace, he had to fight against invading tribes on the Danube. While he admonished himself to be mild, he had to make tough decisions as emperor. And this is exactly where the big question of this video begins. Can a person remain good if he has absolute power? Feel free to write your opinion in the comments. Do you believe that power reveals a person's character, or does power change every person sooner or later? I'm looking forward to your answers. In this video, we dive deep into the life of Marcus Aurelius. We look at his childhood, his rise, his philosophy, his wars, his doubts, and his legacy. We look not only at the emperor, but also at the person behind the power. For Marcus Aurelius was not an unapproachable hero made of marble. He was a man who struggled with fear, responsibility, illness, grief, and inner pressure, and yet tried to act justly. If you are interested in history, power, philosophy, and the great personalities of antiquity, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about the people, decisions, and turning points that have shaped our world. And with that, we begin the story of an emperor who sought inner peace in the noise of the world. The story of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher on the throne. 1. Young Marcus. Marcus Aurelius was born in Rome on April 26, 121, into a world that seemed orderly, powerful, and almost unshakable on the outside. The Roman Empire was at the height of its expansion and self-confidence. From Britain to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria, the roads, laws, garrisons, and administrative structures of Rome stretched. Anyone born into a noble family during this time was not simply born as a child, but as part of a huge political and social system in which origin, upbringing, and relationships could decide on their entire life. Marcus Aurelius, who was originally called Marcus Annius Verus, grew up in this very world. No one knew yet that this boy would one day become an emperor whose thoughts would still be read almost 2,000 years later. His family belonged to the highest Roman society. The gens Aeneae, from which Marcus came, was respected, wealthy, and politically well-connected. His ancestors originally came from Hispania, the western part of the empire, but like so many important families of the time, they had long since found their place in the center of Roman power. Rome was no longer just the city of the old Italian noble families. The elite of the empire had become broader. Men from Spain, Gaul, North Africa, Asia Minor, or Syria, if they were rich, loyal, and capable, could rise to the Senate and even close to the imperial house. Marcus Aurelius' family was an example of this development. It combined provincial origins with Roman education, wealth, and aristocratic ambition. However, his father, Marcus Annius Verus, died early, probably when Marcus was still a young child. This loss shaped his childhood, even if he looked back on his family only briefly and dignified in his later notes. In the Roman world, the death of the father meant not only personal pain, but also a change in social and political protection. A boy from a noble family needed support, guidance, and a male role model to introduce him to the world of offices, duties, and expectations. This role was mainly played by his grandfather, also Marcus Annius Verus, a respected senator and three-time consul. He made sure that the young Marcus was not only brought up in a manner befitting his status, but also grew up early in an environment that demanded discipline, dignity, and public responsibility. His mother Domitia Lucilla also played an important role. She came from a rich and influential family and owned considerable wealth, including brickworks, which were important for Rome's construction industry. But more important to Marcus than her possessions was apparently her character. Later, he recalled her piety, her generosity, and her simple way of life, even though she was rich. This is remarkable, because especially in the Roman upper class, pomp, status, and public representation were omnipresent. Those who were rich showed it. Those who had rank made it visible. If Marcus later praised simplicity and repeatedly warned against vanity, then perhaps this was also an echo of his early domestic imprint. So young Marcus did not grow up in poverty, insecurity, or social marginalization. He was a child of privilege. But this privilege did not mean freedom in the modern sense. It meant expectation. A boy of his class was prepared early on to take on public duties later on. His childhood was not only play and family, but education, observation, and formation. In Rome, education was considered a sign of belonging to the elite. Anyone who wanted to lead had to be able to speak, judge, know history, understand laws, and move in the world of Greek and Roman culture. Greek education in particular was indispensable for the Roman upper class. Philosophy, rhetoric, literature, and ethics were not regarded as mere ornaments, but as the basis for a life of responsibility. Marcus is said to have been serious, attentive, and unusually dutiful even as a child. Ancient sources portray him as a boy who stood out early on for his modesty, willingness to learn, and moral seriousness. Of course, one must be careful with such descriptions, because later authors tended to portray great men as extraordinary even in their childhood. Nevertheless, this image fits with what we can see from his own self-observations. Marcus Aurelius was not a man of loud gestures. He was not a ruler who staged himself as a conqueror or bathed in glory. He was a person who constantly examined himself, who worked on himself, who exhorted himself to control himself. It is quite possible that this inner strictness was inherent in him early on. An important station in his youth was the attention of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138, was an educated, travel-loving, and politically vigilant emperor. He apparently recognized the potential of young Marcus early on. According to tradition, Hadrian is said to have appreciated him for his truthfulness and seriousness. It is even said that he jokingly turned the name Verus, which means true, into Verissimus, i.e. the most truthful. Whether this anecdote took place exactly like this is less decisive than its meaning. It shows the image of Marcus that was formed early on, a boy who did not stand out for his wildness, ambition, or military toughness, but for his character. Hadrian's interest was of great importance to Marcus. In the Roman imperial period, proximity to the ruling house could decide careers. The emperor was not only head of state, but also the center of an extensive network of favor, rank, and future opportunities. When Hadrian noticed a young aristocrat, it could change his life decisively. For Marcus, this slowly opened up a path that his birth alone would not have guaranteed. He moved close to those political circles in which succession, adoptions, and the future of the Reich were considered. But before Marcus himself became part of the imperial succession, he had to be educated. His education was comprehensive and demanding. He learned Latin and Greek, studied literature, law, oratory, and philosophy. His teachers were particularly important. In the Roman elite, a teacher was not just someone who imparted knowledge. He was often also a moral role model, spiritual companion, and social contact. Marcus learned from various important men of his time, including rhetors and philosophers, who shaped him in different ways. The art of oratory was necessary because a senator and later an emperor had to speak, convince, and above all, appear dignified. But Marcus was apparently more attracted to philosophy than to the brilliant language of rhetoricians. Early on, he developed a closeness to the Stoic way of thinking. The Stoa taught that man cannot control everything that happens to him, but he can control his attitude towards it. Wealth, fame, disease, loss, power, and death are external things. The decisive factor is whether one acts sensibly, justly, bravely, and moderately. For a young man of the highest rank, this was a demanding apprenticeship. Because his world offered many temptations: luxury, recognition, influence, social vanity. Stoic philosophy, on the other hand, demanded self-control and inner independence. Marcus didn't just take up these ideas as a theory. They became a standard by which he was to measure himself again and again. One should therefore not think of his youth as a romantic childhood in which a future philosopher dreamily pondered life. Marcus lived in a political world. All around him were expectations, family interests, and the invisible proximity of power. He saw how rank worked. He saw how people behaved at court. He learned that words had to be chosen carefully and that public dignity could be a shield. At the same time, a deep need apparently arose in him not to be corrupted by this world. Later, he wrote again and again against arrogance, anger, laziness, and fame. These admonitions are so powerful because they do not come from a peaceful study, but from the life of a man who knew exactly how strong such forces can affect a person. Another important point is that Marcus grew up in a time of relative stability. Hadrian's rule had consolidated the empire, fortified borders, and avoided or crushed major uprisings. Rome seemed strong, managed, orderly. For a young aristocrat, it might seem as if this empire was almost self-evident. But it was precisely this apparent stability that was deceptive. The borders had to be constantly protected. The army devoured enormous resources. The provinces had different interests, and the question of succession in the empire always remained dangerous. There was no simple hereditary monarchy with undisputed rules. Adoption, Senate approval, military loyalty, and dynastic connections all played together. Marcus grew up in a realm that was strong, but had to constantly regain his inner balance. As a child and adolescent, he may not have been able to fully recognize this, but he was introduced to a world where power was never just splendor. Power meant obligation, observation, and danger. Those who were close to the imperial family could rise, but also fail. Anyone who became a beacon of hope lost a piece of their private life. Marcus was later to pay this price in full. Young Marcus was thus more than just a gifted aristocrat. It was the product of a special historical constellation. His family gave him rank and education. The early death of his father made other protective figures important. His mother instilled in him an ideal of dignity and simplicity. His grandfather secured his position. Hadrian recognized in him a possible building block for the future of the empire. And philosophy gave him an inner language with which he could shape himself. He was not yet an emperor, not a general, not an author of self-reflections. He was a young man who learned what it meant to be a Roman, to be an aristocrat, and perhaps one day to bear responsibility. But it was already in these early years that the core of the personality that would later appear so extraordinary emerged. A person who not only wanted to possess power, but also to justify it morally. A person who did not ask above all how to rule, but how to remain decent. And it was precisely this question that was to accompany his entire life. 2. Rome in the 2nd century. To understand Marcus Aurelius, one must first understand the world into which he was born. The Rome of the 2nd century was no longer the troubled city of the early Republic, in which noble families fought for offices and generals reached for autocracy through civil wars. Nor was it the young empire of Augustus that was looking for a new order after decades of internal violence. Marcus Aurelius grew up in an empire that saw itself as the center of the known world. Rome was not simply a city. Rome was a claim, a system, an order, an idea of power that had been laid over seas, mountains, deserts, and rivers. In the 2nd century, the Roman Empire reached its greatest expansion, and at the same time a form of stability that was later often described as the Golden Age. From the foggy borders of Britain to the hot landscapes of Egypt, from the cities of Hispania to the Syrian trading centers of the East, provinces were under Roman rule. Legions secured borders, roads connected cities, ports directed the flow of goods, officials administered taxes, judges administered justice, and signs of the Roman way of life appeared everywhere: forums, baths, amphitheaters, aqueducts, temples, administrative buildings, and cobbled streets. For the elites of many provinces, Rome meant not only submission, but also access to prestige, career, education, and economic advancement. But this shiny surface should not be deceiving. The empire was large, powerful, and admirably organized, but it was also a structure full of tensions. Every border had to be guarded, every province integrated, every city supplied, and every army paid. The Pax Romana, i.e. the Roman peace, was not a peaceful state in the modern sense. It was a result of constant control, military strength, and political adaptation. Peace prevailed where Rome was strong enough to prevent uprisings, deter rivals, and bind local elites to itself. Behind the calm were legions, administrative files, tax collectors, and the unspoken threat of Roman violence. For a young aristocrat like Marcus Annius Verus, the later Marcus Aurelius, this world was both natural and obligatory. He was born into an order that offered him many advantages. The upper class of the empire lived in a cultural space that combined Latin and Greek, Roman law and Greek education, political career, and philosophical self-formation. In Rome itself, but also in cities such as Athens, Ephesus, Antioch, Carthage, or Alexandria, an urban life flourished that benefited from the wealth of the empire. Those who belonged to the elite could take office, donate public buildings, give speeches, appear in court, promote religious festivals, and present themselves as benefactors of their city. Status was visible. He was shown in clothing, houses, attendants, inscriptions, statues of honor, and public appearances. At the same time, Rome was a deeply hierarchical society. Freedom and citizenship were highly valued, but they did not apply equally to all people. Senators stood above knights, citizens over non-citizens, freeborns over freedmen, men over women, masters over slaves. Slavery was not a marginal phenomenon, but a fundamental part of the economy and everyday life. In rich households, slaves worked as servants, scribes, teachers, cooks, administrators, or craftsmen. On country estates, in workshops, and in mines, their lives could be hard and cruel. So the Roman Empire was not only a world of marble columns and philosophy, but also a world of dependence, inequality, and violence. Marcus Aurelius was later to think a lot about humanity, self-control, and justice, but he did so within a society whose order is full of contradictions for modern eyes. Politically, the empire was a monarchy that still adorned itself with republican forms. The emperor ruled, but the Senate continued to exist. Consuls were appointed, magistrates had their dignities, laws were formulated, and the old language of the republic remained alive. But the real power lay with the princeps, the first man of the state. He controlled the armies, determined the political direction, distributed favors, decided careers, and could decide on the life and death of opponents. A good emperor, therefore, had to be more than an administrator. He had to function as a judge, general, high priest, benefactor, patron, and symbol of order. His person associated the vast empire with an idea of stability. If the emperor was strong, just, and recognized, the empire seemed safe. If the succession became unclear or the emperor was considered weak, the entire order could be shaken. The time before Marcus Aurelius' reign was marked by emperors who were later considered particularly capable. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius stand for a phase in which adoption and careful selection of the successor seemed more important than pure blood relations. This system was not enshrined in law, but in retrospect it seemed like a clever solution to the problem of the transfer of power. An emperor could adopt a suitable man, build him up politically, and thus prepare a peaceful succession. Marcus Aurelius himself was to benefit from this system. But even this order was fragile. It depended on the character of the participants, on the consent of the army, the Senate, the court, and the ability to pacify rivals. Rome did not have a completely certain procedure for the election of the emperor. Every change of power remained a possible moment of danger. Economically, the empire was impressively networked. Grain from Egypt and North Africa supplied Rome and other large cities. Wine, oil, ceramics, metal goods, spices, fabrics and luxury goods moved along roads and sea routes. The Mediterranean had become a Roman inland sea in many respects. Merchants, soldiers, officials, pilgrims, philosophers, doctors, and artisans traveled through an area connected by law, currency, and infrastructure. Nevertheless, a message could take weeks or months to get from one border to another. The emperor had to rule over an empire that was amazingly organized, but never reacted quickly enough when several crises broke out at the same time. It was precisely this slowness of communication that later became important for Marcus Aurelius, when pressure arose on various fronts and decisions had to be made under uncertainty. The army was also a crucial pillar of the system. About 30 legions and numerous auxiliary troops secured the borders. The soldiers were not only fighters, but also road builders, fortress builders, technicians and bearers of Roman culture. On the Rhine, Danube, Euphrates, in Britain, North Africa, and other border regions, they often lived in permanent camps for years. Military communities, trading centers, and settlements were established there. The border was not simply a line on a map. It was a space of exchange, control, and constant tension. Beyond the borders lived peoples and tribal associations with whom Rome traded, made alliances, exchanged embassies, or waged war. As long as Rome had a strong effect, these relations could work. However, when outer groups came under pressure or suspected Roman weakness, the borders became dangerous. In the 2nd century, there were already signs of changes that would later weigh heavily on the reign of Marcus Aurelius. On the Danube and in the northern border areas, Germanic and Sarmatian groups were on the move. These movements had many causes: population pressure, rivalries between tribes, migration of more distant groups, economic interests, and the attraction of Roman wealth. Rome was often able to control such developments for a time through diplomacy, payments, alliances, and military deterrence. But it could not stop them completely. The border was never as fixed as Roman buildings and maps made it seem. The cultural life of this time was rich and multi-layered. The Roman elite admired Greek education. An educated man must know Homer, Plato, Demosthenes, and other Greek authors. Philosophy was not just a theoretical subject, but a means of living. Stoics, Platonists, Aristotelians, and other schools of thought offered answers to questions about virtue, happiness, death, fate, and duty. For Marcus Aurelius, the Stoa was particularly decisive. But here, too, a contradiction of the Roman world becomes apparent. The same men who discussed virtue and humanity could own slaves, eliminate political opponents, or justify wars. Philosophy did not move outside of power. She had to prove herself in it. Religion also played a central role. The empire was full of cults, temples, sacrificial acts, and local deities. The Roman religion demanded less inner faith in the modern sense than public participation, respect for the gods, and integration into the order of the state. The emperor also had religious significance. His family, his genius, and in some regions, his person were worshipped. This religious diversity could be surprisingly tolerant, as long as it did not disturb public order. But groups that refused to perform certain acts of sacrifice or rejected the claim of state rituals could arouse mistrust. The early Christians, whose relationship with the Roman state was increasingly tense in the 2nd century, also belonged to this context. For Marcus, this world meant a double imprint. On the one hand, he grew up in an era that taught him order, education, security, and an ideal of reasonable rule. On the other hand, he lived in an empire whose stability was based on conditions that could not last forever. The army had to remain loyal. The borders must remain controllable. The economy had to function. The succession had to be peaceful. The provinces had to see enough advantages to accept Rome. The elites had to play along. The emperor had to appear strong, but not tyrannical. Mildness was desired, weakness dangerous. Justice was an ideal, but power often demanded toughness. This tension between ideal and reality was to determine the life of Marcus Aurelius. He was born into what later appeared to be the pinnacle of Roman order, but he was to experience how vulnerable this order was. The Rome of his youth looked like a huge building made of stone, law, and discipline. But forces were already moving under the foundations that would one day make cracks visible. Marcus Aurelius did not only grow up in the splendor of the empire. He grew up on the verge of an upcoming endurance test without knowing it. And perhaps this explains the tragedy of his life. The man who sought inner peace was to rule an empire that found less and less peace. 3. Adoption by Antoninus Pius. The history of Marcus Aurelius can hardly be understood without the Roman system of adoption. In the modern imagination, adoption usually means a family decision, combined with care, parenthood, and private commitment. In the Roman imperial family, however, adoption was far more than a personal act. It was a political instrument. It was able to shape careers, secure power, prepare successions, and stabilize entire dynasties. Precisely because the empire was not a simple, fixed hereditary monarchy, adoption could become a means of answering the most dangerous question of any rule: who comes after the emperor? For the young Marcus Annius Verus, the later Marcus Aurelius, this question became decisive in his life at an early age. Although he had been born into a respected and influential family, that alone did not make him the future ruler of the empire. Many young men from senatorial houses had origins, education, and connections. What made Marcus special was the attention he gained in Emperor Hadrian's entourage. Hadrian apparently recognized early on that this serious, gifted, and striking boy could be important for the future of the empire. But between this early favor and the imperial throne lay an intricate web of dynastic planning, political caution, and personal calculation. Hadrian was a powerful, educated, but also difficult ruler. He had not enlarged the empire by great conquests like Trajan, but had secured, traveled, and fortified it. His policy was aimed at consolidation. Borders were stabilized, administration improved, provinces more closely involved. But at the end of his reign, he faced a problem that no emperor could ignore. He needed a successor. A poor transition could trigger civil war, power struggles, and military insecurity. In such moments, the Roman Empire was not only dependent on laws, but also on recognition. The Senate had to accept the new ruler, the army had to follow him, the court had to support him, and the provinces had to recognize his authority. Hadrian's first succession planning failed. He had adopted Lucius Aelius Caesar and made him his heir, but he died in 138, before Hadrian himself. This suddenly made the question of succession open again. For an aging and sick emperor, this was dangerous. A solution had to be found quickly, but not just any one. Hadrian needed someone who was politically viable, could be accepted by the Senate, and at the same time would secure the next generation. In this situation, he chose Titus Aurelius Antoninus, who later became Antoninus Pius. Antoninus was a respected senator, experienced, wealthy, reliable, and not known as a dangerous power seeker. He was not a young conqueror, not an ambitious military leader, not a man who would plunge the empire into adventure. This is exactly what made him attractive. But Hadrian attached this adoption to a decisive condition. Antoninus, for his part, was to adopt two younger men, Marcus Annius Verus and Lucius Verus, the son of the deceased Aelius Caesar. In this way, Hadrian created a staggered succession. Antoninus was initially to take power, but Marcus and Lucius were to be prepared as the next generation. It was a political construct of remarkable foresight. Hadrian not only arranged his immediate succession, but also tried to secure the future of the imperial house for several decades. Marcus was thus elevated to a position that fundamentally changed his life. When Antoninus adopted him, Marcus was given a new name and a new place in the order of the empire. Marcus Annius Verus became Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus Caesar. Names were not just personal designations in Rome. They showed origin, affiliation, legal status, and political significance. Through the adoption, Marcus became part of the imperial family. He was no longer just a promising young aristocrat, but a designated heir. Every action, every education, every public appearance took on a new meaning. From then on, he was no longer considered just a private person. He was observed as a man of the future. For Marcus, this change must have been enormous. He was still young, but suddenly a shadow of coming responsibility lay over his life. In a society in which rank and duty were closely linked, such an elevation could not simply be understood as luck. It meant honor, but also loss. A future emperor no longer belonged to himself. His education, his marriage, his public offices, his relationships, and even his personal stance became part of a political plan. What had previously been character formation now became preparation for domination. Antoninus Pius became emperor after Hadrian's death in 138. The epithet pious, i.e. the dutiful or pious, was related to his behavior towards Hadrian. Hadrian was not without controversy in the Senate at the end of his life, and Antoninus campaigned for his adoptive father to be deified. This loyalty to the deceased was considered an expression of special pietas, that Roman virtue that included duty to family, gods, state, and ancestors. For Marcus, Antoninus was more than a political guardian. He became a central role model. In his later self-reflections, Marcus Aurelius remembers him with great respect. He praises his mildness, his prudence, his industriousness, his calmness, his ability to listen, and his aversion to empty boasting. It was precisely these years under Antoninus Pius that had a profound impact on Marcus. Antoninus was not a spectacular emperor in the sense of great campaigns or dramatic reforms. His rule seemed calm, careful, and stable. He hardly left Italy, did not wage any major wars of conquest, and ruled with a mixture of legal rigor, personal restraint, and conservative governance. For some later observers, this may seem less exciting than the reign of Trajan or Hadrian, but it was important for the internal stability of the empire. Marcus learned at this court that rule does not always consist of grand gestures. It often consists of daily decision-making, listening to petitions, weighing legal cases, dealing with officials, senators, and provinces, and maintaining moderation. This was a political school of inestimable value. Marcus learned not only theory, but practice. He saw how an emperor could assert his authority without constantly spreading fear. He saw how important patience was. He saw that the ruler's calm could radiate to the entire administration. Antoninus Pius gave him an ideal of power based on self-control. It was not the emperor who gave the loudest orders who was the strongest, but the one who had himself under control. For a young man who was already inclined towards philosophy, this model had to have a profound effect. At the same time, the adoption also remained a sign of political coldness. Marcus was not put in this position out of mere affection, but because he was needed. The Roman elite functioned according to interests, alliances, and expectations. His person became part of a strategy to secure the empire. Thus, there was a tension over his youth that became decisive for his later life. On the one hand, he believed in duty, reason, and moral self-formation. On the other hand, he himself was the result of a power plan. His rise was not simply the reward of inner virtue, but also the result of dynastic calculation. This tension is particularly evident in the connection to Lucius Verus. Hadrian had included not only Marcus, but also Lucius in the order of succession. Lucius was the son of the previously intended Aelius Caesar, and thus brought in another dynastic line. His adoption prevented followers or associations of this line from being excluded. Marcus and Lucius thus became brothers in the legal and political sense, even if their personalities were very different. Marcus was considered serious, dutiful, and philosophical. Lucius was later associated with joie de vivre, representation, and military glory. The joint involvement of both men was an attempt to avoid possible rivalries. But at the same time, it laid the foundation for an unusual dual power that was to become reality decades later. For Marcus, the new position also meant careful public staging. He received honors, offices and titles at an early age that brought him to power. Such steps were important because the Roman ruling class had to be accustomed to seeing him as the coming ruler. Authority didn't come about overnight. It was prepared. A future emperor had to be visible without overshadowing the incumbent emperor. He had to learn, but at the same time he had to radiate dignity. He had to meet expectations without expanding his own power base too much too soon. This required sensitivity, and Marcus seems to have possessed this sensitivity. His engagement and later marriage policy were also particularly significant. Marcus had originally been married to the daughter of Aelius Caesar, but according to the new order, he was later betrothed to Faustina the Younger, daughter of Antoninus Pius, and finally married. This connection bound him even more closely to Antoninus and to the imperial house. Marriage in this world has rarely been only private. It was dynastic architecture. Through Faustina, Marcus became not only the adopted son, but also the son-in-law of the emperor. His position was thus further consolidated. At the same time, his personal life was put even more in the service of political stability. The adoption by Antoninus Pius was therefore not a single moment, but the beginning of a long transformation. Marcus was gradually detached from the life of a high-ranking young senator and introduced into the role of the future emperor. His education became more serious, his public importance greater, his freedom smaller. He learned that power does not begin suddenly when you are given the title of emperor. Power begins even before that, in the expectations of others, in the observation by the public, in the duty to prove oneself worthy of a role. For Marcus Aurelius, this experience was perhaps the origin of a lifelong inner vigilance. Those who know from a young age that they are being watched learn to control themselves. Those who learn early on that their life does not belong to them alone develop either vanity or discipline. With Marcus, it seems to have been discipline above all. Philosophy offered him an inner counterweight. While politics forced him into a role, the Stoa gave him a way not to confuse this role with his whole self. He could become emperor and still remember that fame, rank, and power are transient. He could rise to the highest position and still ask himself whether he was acting justly, moderately, and reasonably. The adoption by Antoninus Pius was thus one of the decisive turning points of his life. Without them, Marcus might have become an important senator, scholar, or administrator. With it, he became the heir to a world empire. But it didn't just make him more powerful. It made his life more difficult. It imposed a future on him that he could not simply refuse. It placed him in a chain of expectations that ranged from Hadrian's political planning to Antoninus' quiet rule to the later crisis of the empire. As Marcus grew into this new role, he couldn't have known what trials awaited him. He knew the tranquility of the court, the order of the administration, the dignity of the Senate, and the teachings of his philosophers. He saw in Antoninus Pius a model of rational rule. But the world he would one day rule would become far more restless than the world of his education. This is precisely why this adoption was so important. It gave Rome an heir. She gave Marcus a task. And she irrevocably linked the fate of a thoughtful young man to the fate of the Roman Empire. 4. Education, philosophy, and character. Marcus Aurelius' education was much more than a preparation for offices, speeches, and courtly duties. It was an attempt to turn a young member of the Roman elite into a person who would be able to carry power without being internally destroyed by it. In the world in which Marcus grew up, education was not a private hobby or a mere ornament of the mind. It was a sign of rank, a tool of political effect, and a moral claim. Anyone who was later to speak in the Senate, decide on law, administer provinces, or even rule an empire had to be able to do more than give orders. He had to master language, know traditions, understand historical examples, examine philosophical attitudes, and move himself in a society in which every word and gesture could have meaning. Early on, Marcus received a careful education that was only open to the highest circles of the empire. His teachers were among the most respected men of their time. They taught him grammar, rhetoric, literature, law, Greek culture, and philosophy. Latin was the language of Roman administration and political dignity, but Greek was the language of high culture. A Roman aristocrat who wanted to be considered had to be able to move in both worlds. He had to know Cicero, but also Homer. He had to honor the Roman tradition, but at the same time recognize the intellectual authority of Athens. In this combination of Roman duty and Greek philosophy, the spiritual space arose in which Marcus Aurelius later developed his own inner attitude. Rhetoric was particularly important. In Rome, the ability to speak was a power. A man of the elite had to appear in court, convince in the Senate, take a stand at public events, and express his thoughts clearly, dignified, and effectively. Words were tools of a career. They were able to calm enemies, win followers, explain laws, answer requests, or justify decisions. Marcus learned this art, but he never seems to have completely fallen for it. The brilliant speech, the artful formulation, the applause of the audience, and the play with effect and impression remained inwardly suspicious to him. He respected language, but he distrusted the vanity that could hide in language. For him, a word should not only sound beautiful, but be truthful. A central figure in his education was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, one of the most famous orators of his time. Fronto was a teacher, friend, and correspondent of the young Marcus. From their surviving correspondence, one recognizes a relationship that went far beyond ordinary teaching. Fronto loved language, classical Latin expression, style, elegance, and rhetorical art. He wanted to make Marcus a man who could excel in Latin speech. Marcus respected him very much, but his own development increasingly led him in a different direction. The more he was attracted by philosophy, the less the art of beautiful words was enough for him. There was thus a quiet tension between Fronto and Marcus. The teacher wanted to form the great orator. The student was increasingly looking for the morally stable person. This tension was not a simple contrast between rhetoric and truth. Fronto was not a superficial man either. But for Marcus, the question of whether education really improves character or just creates the impression of education became increasingly important. In the Roman elite, there were many men who appeared educated, gave elegant speeches, and referred to Greek authors, but who could still act ambitiously, cruelly, bribely, or vainly. Marcus apparently realized early on that knowledge alone is not enough. A person can know the best sentences about virtue and still act unjustly. He can talk about moderation and live excessively. He can quote philosophers and yet be dominated by a lust for fame inside. That's exactly why philosophy became not just a lesson for Marcus, but an exercise. The decisive spiritual force in his life became the Stoa. This philosophical school had a long history, dating back to Hellenistic Greece. For the Stoics, the world was permeated by order and reason. Man could not determine what would happen to him in life. Illness, loss, insult, political crisis, death, and coincidence were often beyond his control. But man could determine how to respond to it inwardly. He could learn to examine his judgments, control his passions, and align his actions with virtue. True happiness was not in wealth, power, lust, or recognition, but in a reasonable and virtuous life. For a future emperor, this doctrine was tremendously demanding. For Marcus did not live in a simple world of seclusion. He was surrounded by rank, luxury, honor, and political expectation. Everything around him told him that he was important. The Stoa reminded him that even an important man remains mortal, limited, and fallible. Everything around him made him the center of attention. Philosophy taught him to see himself as part of a larger whole. Everything around him could tempt him to judge people according to their usefulness, rank, and proximity to power. The Stoa called on him to see in every human being a rational being, even if the social reality of Rome often contradicted this ideal. Marcus didn't just take up this lesson like a student studying for an exam. He tried to inscribe it in his way of life. Later, in his self-reflections, it becomes apparent how much philosophy was a daily work on himself for him. He admonishes himself to get up in the morning, even if his body is sluggish. He remembers to put up with people who are ungrateful, false, envious, or inconsiderate. He warns himself against anger, pride, and self-pity. He thinks about death, not to appear gloomy, but to break through the vanity of life. Those who see death clearly should use the present more justly. Those who realize how quickly fame passes should strive less for applause. This attitude did not arise suddenly in old age. It was prepared in the youth. Marcus learned from teachers, but also through observation. He saw at court how people changed when they smelled power. He saw how favor was sought, how closeness to the emperor was staged, how ambition was concealed or openly shown. He experienced a society in which external rank counted enormously. This is precisely why the question of inner independence became so important to him. When a person makes himself completely dependent on praise, fear, advantage, and public opinion, he loses himself. For Marcus, self-control became a form of inner freedom. But Marcus Aurelius must not be made an unworldly thinker. His philosophy was not an escape from politics, but a preparation for it. He did not want to act out of the world, but in the right way. The Stoa did not require a person to abandon all duties and withdraw into solitude. On the contrary, she emphasized that every person has a role in the community. Whoever is a father should act as a father. Anyone who is a citizen should act as a citizen. Whoever is emperor should act as emperor. The decisive factor is not whether one has a difficult task, but whether one fulfills it with justice, reason, and moderation. This idea was a deep fit for Marcus' situation. He hadn't chosen his future freely, but he could decide how to face it. His character was thus formed in the field of tension between inner inclination and outer duty. By nature, Marcus seems to have been serious, sensitive, and self-critical. Perhaps without dynastic expectations, he would have preferred a life as a scholar, judge, or quiet statesman. But his path led him closer and closer to the highest power. Philosophy helped him to see this development not only as a rise, but as a burden. A ruler who believes that power is reward easily becomes vain. A ruler who understands power as a duty tends to remain vigilant. Marcus tried to keep this vigilance. His physical and personal discipline also played a role in this. In ancient tradition, he appears as someone who valued simple ways of life, did not like to indulge in luxury, and at times even tended to strict asceticism. As a young man, he is said to have slept on a simple bed and exposed himself to philosophical strictness. Whether all the details are exactly right is less important than the picture they convey. Marcus didn't want to be softened. He knew that comfort can weaken character, but at the same time, he had to learn that a future emperor does not live only for himself. Too much asceticism could also be problematic if it endangered health or appeared as a demonstrative departure from courtly duties. Here, too, he had to find measure. The ideal of moderation was central in general. Marcus Aurelius did not become a fanatic of philosophy, but a man who repeatedly exhorted himself to be balanced. He did not want to be guided by anger, but he also did not want to be weak in decision-making. He wanted to be mild, but not careless. He wanted to live simply, but not despise his imperial role. He wanted to love people, but to see their faults clearly. This balance was difficult, and it was precisely for this reason that he kept returning to it in his mind. His philosophy was not a possession he had once acquired, but an exercise that had to be renewed daily. Many influences were combined in his education. His family gave him a sense of dignity and duty. From Antoninus Pius he learned calm, patience, and the quiet authority of a moderate ruler. He learned language and expression from Fronto, even if he later limited rhetoric internally. His philosophical teachers gave him tools for self-examination. From Greek culture, he took up the great questions of virtue, reason, and world order. From Rome he took the seriousness of public responsibility. Out of all this came a character that was not flawless, but unusually conscious. It is precisely this awareness that makes Marcus Aurelius fascinating to this day. Many rulers wanted to be seen as strong, many as victorious, many as divinely favored. Marcus Aurelius appears differently. He didn't want to believe himself that rank made him better. He knew that an emperor is just as mortal as a servant, that an order is not automatically just, that praise evaporates, and that man is endangered precisely when everyone else exalts him. His education had not only made him smarter. She had given him an inner countervoice, a voice that kept asking him if he was doing the right thing. As Marcus grew older and his position in the imperial house became firmer, this inner formation had long been part of his personality. He did not enter the future as a carefree prince, but as a man who felt the burden of coming responsibility. He had learned that rule is not only a question of laws, armies, and titles, but also a question of character. Because in the end, an empire can be outwardly strong and yet suffer under a bad ruler. An emperor can have many advisors and still make wrong decisions if he does not control himself. Marcus Aurelius understood early on that the most difficult government was not that of provinces, soldiers, and senators, but of one's own interior. Thus, the young Marcus became not only an educated aristocrat, but a person who regarded his life as a moral task. Philosophy did not give him easy answers, but it gave him direction. She did not promise him that he could avoid suffering, but that he had to keep his composure in suffering. She did not promise him that power was innocent, but that a person could seek justice in power. And it prepared him for a truth that was to determine his later life. Those who rule over others must never cease to examine themselves. 5. Life at the court of Antoninus Pius. When Antoninus Pius took over the rule of the Roman Empire in 138, a particularly formative phase of his life began for the young Marcus. He was no longer just a promising member of the senatorial elite, but the adopted son of the emperor and thus one of the most important men of the coming generation. His future was no longer open. If nothing unforeseen happened, it led to the top of the empire. But precisely for this reason, life at the court of Antoninus Pius was not a time of courtly comfort, but a long school of power. Marcus learned there how an empire was governed not by big words, but by daily work, patience, and self-control. Antoninus Pius was not an emperor of dramatic gestures. He did not wage any major wars of conquest, did not present himself as a restless general, and rarely left Italy. At first glance, his reign could seem almost unspectacular, especially compared to Trajan, who had expanded the empire militarily, or Hadrian, who traveled the provinces and left traces of his personality everywhere. But it was precisely this calm that was part of his strength. Antoninus understood rule as preservation. He did not want to enlarge the empire through risky adventures, but to maintain its order, stabilize its administration, and consolidate the authority of the empire through reliability. For Marcus, this way of governing became a living lesson. The court of Antoninus was not a place where a future emperor grew up merely in luxury. Of course, there was wealth, servitude, dignity, ceremonies, and the visible signs of imperial power. But at the center was a huge work apparatus. Reports, petitions, legal questions, complaints, petitions, recommendations, and warnings came from all parts of the empire. Cities asked for privileges, provinces reported problems, officials expected decisions, senators sought influence, military commanders reported on the borders, envoys from foreign peoples appeared with demands or gifts. The emperor had to listen, examine, weigh, and decide. Rule meant taking an infinite sequence of small and large questions seriously. Marcus was able to observe at close range how Antoninus fulfilled this task. He saw a ruler who did not judge hastily and was not easily driven by anger or flattery. In his later self-reflections, Marcus Aurelius praises Antoninus in particular for his balance, his patience, his sober way of life, his steadfastness, and his ability to listen to people. This is revealing, because it shows what Marcus admired in a ruler. Not glamour, not military boasting, not theatrical severity, but moderation. For him, Antoninus embodied the idea that true authority does not have to be loud. An emperor could be strong precisely because he remained calm. However, this calm was not weakness. Antoninus Pius was a man of control. He held the reins firmly in his hand without having to show toughness all the time. The administration of the empire remained stable under him. The finances were carefully managed. The relationship with the Senate was comparatively peaceful, and there were no major internal upheavals. This stability required political wisdom. An emperor had to respect aristocratic families without giving them too much room for power games. He had to satisfy the army without making himself appear dependent on it. He had to take the provinces seriously without weakening the central authority. He had to show leniency without giving the impression that laws were arbitrary. For Marcus, this balance was a crucial lesson. He learned that an empire is not held together by victories alone. Most days of an emperor do not consist of battles, but of administration. Jurisprudence, finances, personnel decisions, religious duties, Senate meetings, public appearances, correspondence, and the control of civil servants form the true everyday life of power. Anyone who only sees the triumphal procession does not understand the empire. Marcus saw the desk behind the triumph, the files behind the glory, the responsibility behind the purple. Justice in particular played an important role in the everyday life of the emperor. The emperor was considered the supreme judge and last instance. People turned to him when local authorities failed, when disputes escalated, or when special grace was requested. Antoninus Pius was known for his legal diligence. He sought balance, paid attention to procedures, and apparently preferred decisions that were not unnecessarily cruel. This did not mean that the Roman world was modern or uniform. It remained hard, hierarchical, and marked by many injustices. But within their own order, an emperor could act more or less moderately. Marcus learned that law was not just a legal text, but an attitude. A judge had to be patient. He had to beware of prejudices. He had to remain attentive even when the cases became annoying to him. In addition to the administration, the relationship with the Senate played a major role. The Senate had long since lost its old republican power, but it remained a central symbol of Roman dignity and a rallying point for the elite. An emperor who humiliated the Senate risked hatred, intrigue, and a bad posthumous fame. An emperor who made him too strong endangered his own position. Antoninus found a way to respect the Senate and at the same time not to allow the imperial superiority to be called into question. Marcus watched this art of political dealings closely. He learned that power does not always mean openly dominating others. Sometimes it means involving them in such a way that they feel respected and still serve the imperial order. Antoninus was also a role model for Marcus in his personal appearance. He was not a man of lavish self-dramatization. He obviously loved consistency, simplicity, and regulated processes. For Marcus, who was already prone to stoic self-discipline, this was of great importance. At court, he could have learned to enjoy power as a stage. Instead, he saw an emperor who understood power as a duty. Antoninus showed him that a ruler does not have to prove every moment how special he is. It was precisely the self-evident nature of serving the task that gave him dignity. Life at court was not only political training for Marcus, but also a test of character. Anyone who lives near the emperor meets people who want something every day. Flatterers, supplicants, ambitious senators, cautious officials, relatives, teachers, friends, and rivals move in a space where words are rarely entirely innocent. Everyone pays attention to rank, proximity, and signs of favor. A look, an invitation, a promotion, a small favor can have political significance. For a young man who is considered a future ruler, this atmosphere is dangerous. It can feed vanity, create mistrust, or bend character. Marcus had to learn to stay vigilant in this world without becoming bitter. Philosophy helped him with this. The Stoic doctrine reminded him that praise and blame are external things. It is not the opinion of others that makes a person good, but his own actions. But this attitude had to be tested again and again in everyday life. It's easy to preach indifference to glory as long as no one is praising you. It is more difficult when you are treated as a future emperor from your youth. Marcus was honored, observed, and prepared. Everyone could see in him the coming center of power. All the more reason for him to work inwardly against the temptation to think of himself as more important than others. During this time, Marcus also took on public tasks and honorary offices. Such steps were part of his political upbringing. He was not suddenly made ruler, but slowly introduced to the role. Titles, offices, and representative tasks made him visible. The elites of the empire should get used to seeing him as his successor. At the same time, he gained experience with the forms of Roman politics. He learned rituals, responsibilities, the interaction between the Senate and the imperial family, the importance of public benefits, and the expectations of a man of his rank. He always had to remain in Antoninus' shadow. An heir was allowed to shine, but not too brightly. He had to build trust without showing impatience. This restraint suited Marcus' character. Unlike some ambitious princes, he does not seem to have pushed to take power as quickly as possible. Rather, he developed a deep awareness of how difficult the task was. In Antoninus, he saw not only the man who opened the way to the throne for him, but also a standard by which he would later measure himself. The memories of Antoninus in the self-reflection seem almost like a collection of ruler virtues: patience, industriousness, simplicity, mildness, firmness, loyalty to friends, moderation in pleasure, care in decisions, freedom from envy and vanity. These qualities became for Marcus an inner list of what an emperor should be. At the same time, the world at court was not free of shadows. The calm of the Antonine rule could give the impression that the empire was permanently stable. But this stability was based on prerequisites that Marcus would not find in the same way later. Under Antoninus, there were no major catastrophes. The borders were tense, but not permanently in the conflagration. The plague that would later shake the empire had not yet broken out. The Danube Wars were still ahead of him. So Marcus learned at a court of order, but later had to rule in a time of crisis. This is precisely where there is a tragic tension. It was shaped by an emperor who could preserve, but he himself was to have to fight. Marcus also became more and more closely involved in the imperial family. His union with Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, made him not only the adopted son, but also the son-in-law of the emperor. This strengthened his position dynastically. Marriage, family, and politics were inseparable in this world. Children mean not only personal happiness, but also a future, legitimacy, and hope for continuity. Marcus also experienced at court how private the political and how political the private could be. For a person who searched inwardly for truthfulness, this intertwining was not easy. He had to learn to fulfill roles without completely losing himself in them. The years at the court of Antoninus Pius were therefore a quiet but decisive preparation for the reign. Marcus learned that power requires patience. He learned that an emperor must not be driven by every effect. He learned that administration is just as important as military glory. He learned that mildness and severity do not have to be opposites if they are ordered by reason. But he also learned that the ruler can never be just a private person. His life belongs to the state, his decisions affect millions, and even his character becomes a public affair. When Antoninus Pius was still alive, Marcus was able to observe this burden without having to carry it completely alone. He was close enough to power to understand its mechanisms, but not quite at its top yet. This intermediate position was precious. It gave him time to form himself internally. It allowed him to see the mistakes of others without immediately bearing the ultimate responsibility himself. It gave him the example of an emperor who ruled not by terror but by constancy. But every school ends. The older Antoninus became, the closer the moment came when Marcus no longer just had to learn, but had to decide for himself. The court had shown him what orderly power could look like. But history would soon teach him that power rarely remains ordered for long. When he later became emperor himself, he was often to remember Antoninus. Not out of nostalgia, but as a moral standard. In a world full of war, illness, and pressure, the image of his adoptive father remained an inner support for him. Life at the court of Antoninus Pius had not prepared Marcus for all the catastrophes that were to come, but it had shown him what attitude a ruler must maintain when the catastrophes begin. 6. Marriage to Faustina and the emperor's family. Marcus Aurelius' marriage to Faustina the Younger was much more than a private union between two people. It was a political bond, a dynastic decision, and at the same time a deep cut in the personal life of a man who was increasingly prepared for the highest responsibility in the empire. In the Roman imperial period, marriage in the ruling house was never just a matter of the heart. It connected families, secured claims, calmed expectations, and created images of continuity. Whoever married the emperor's daughter did not simply become a husband. It became part of a public narrative about the future, legitimacy, and stability. Faustina the Younger was the daughter of Antoninus Pius and the elder Faustina. So she also grew up in the center of power, surrounded by courtly expectations, religious honors, political attention, and dynastic plans. As the daughter of the emperor, she was no ordinary Roman aristocrat, but a woman whose marriage and motherhood became important for the empire. Women of the imperial family were not at the top of the official political order, but they could have enormous influence. Their origins, their marriage, their children, their public presentation, and their proximity to the emperor made them bearers of dynastic legitimacy. They could appear as symbols of fertility, fidelity, dignity, and continuity. At the same time, they were the target of rumors, expectations, and moral judgment. For Marcus, the connection with Faustina was another step into the role he was meant to play. Originally, there had been other marriage plans, because dynastic politics could change depending on the situation. But eventually Faustina became his wife, and thus he became not only the adopted son, but also the son-in-law of Antoninus Pius. This double bond strengthened his position considerably. It made him even more visible as a future ruler and linked his future even more closely to the family of the reigning emperor. In a world where political legitimacy arose not only from laws, but also from names, ancestry, adoption, and public recognition, this marriage was of paramount importance. The marriage was concluded in 145. Marcus was already deeply involved in the imperial succession order at this time, but not yet emperor. He continued to live under the authority of Antoninus Pius and learned step by step the tasks of the rule. Faustina came to his side at a time when his life belonged less and less to himself. Both were part of a system that always interpreted personal relationships politically. Every birth of a child, every public appearance, every honor, and every family decision was observed by the public. The imperial family was not private in the modern sense. It was a political space in which the family became a state affair. The marriage between Marcus and Faustina produced numerous children, but many died early. This fact leads right into a world that, despite power, wealth, and medical care, was constantly accompanied by death. Even in the imperial family, birth and childhood were dangerous. Infant mortality was high, diseases could quickly become fatal, and parents had to endure losses again and again. For modern readers, it can be hard to imagine that an emperor who ruled over vast territories and countless people had to experience the same pain in his own home as many other families of his time. But it is precisely this experience of transience that fits deeply with Marcus Aurelius' later philosophy. When he writes about death, loss, and the fleeting nature of all earthly things, it is not just abstract thinking. Life experience also speaks. Faustina gave birth to many children to Marcus, including the future emperor Commodus. The large number of births had a political significance, because every child could secure the future of the house. But every birth also meant danger for mother and child. In a dynasty, fertility was a public good. An imperial wife was not only seen as a partner, but also as a guarantor of succession. That was an enormous burden. In imperial representation, Faustina was often associated with terms that emphasized motherhood, fertility, and feminine virtue. Coins, honorary titles, and public images depicted her as a central figure of dynastic stability. As a result, her body became part of the political order, so to speak. Their children were not only children, but bearers of hope for the Reich. Marcus Aurelius himself seems to have treated Faustina with respect and affection. In his self-reflections, he mentions them with gratitude and emphasizes their obedience, love, and simplicity. These words are brief but significant. They show that he did not see his marriage only as a political construction. Despite all his dynastic function, he apparently saw Faustina as a companion who played an important role in his life. But you shouldn't imagine their relationship too modern. Roman marriage was based on different legal, social, and moral foundations than today's partnership ideals. Nevertheless, there was affection, trust, closeness, and shared responsibility. Especially in the imperial family, where mistrust and rumors could be omnipresent, loyalty was particularly valuable. However, Faustina was also a controversial figure. Later sources report rumors of alleged infidelity, political influence, and questionable relationships. Such accusations are common among women in the imperial family and must be viewed with caution. In Roman historiography, powerful women were often morally attacked, especially when later events' hindsight suggested a negative interpretation. Since Commodus was later considered a bad emperor, some authors looked for explanations and blame. A mother could then easily become the target of suspicion. Whether the rumors about Faustina were based on facts, court gossip, or hostile propaganda can hardly be decided with certainty. It is important to note that Marcus Aurelius himself apparently stood by her publicly. He had her honored, defended her rank, and preserved her memory. This attitude shows something crucial about Marcus. He was not a man who could easily separate his personal life from political pressure, but he seems to have seen Faustina as a permanent fixture. Precisely because the imperial family was surrounded by rumors, public loyalty meant a lot. An emperor who deprived his wife of her honor would not only have made a private decision, but would have sent a political signal. Marcus did the opposite. Faustina later even accompanied him to the vicinity of military rooms and received the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps. This title showed their symbolic connection to the army and the imperial presence on the fronts. Here, too, it becomes visible how much family, military, and rule were intertwined. The emperor's family was a kind of mirror of order for the empire. A stable household, legitimate children, visible unity, and religious piety conveyed security. The Roman people, the Senate, and the army saw the imperial family as more than a private family. They saw a sign that the future was settled. Therefore, births, weddings, and deaths were not merely personal events. They were publicly mourned, celebrated, shaped, proclaimed, and politically interpreted. When a child of the imperial family died, it was pain for the parents, but also a loss of possible continuity for the empire. If a son survived, the question immediately grew as to whether he would one day rule. For Marcus Aurelius, this question became particularly important through Commodus. As the son of the emperor, Commodus was surrounded by expectations from birth. Marcus, who himself had become an heir through adoption and careful selection, was later faced with a decision of whether to continue the principle of selection or to ensure the succession of his biological son. This question actually belongs in a later chapter, but its roots lie in the family. Every imperial marriage created dynastic possibilities and constraints. The birth of a son was a blessing and at the same time a political bond. A father could love his son, but the emperor had to ask at the same time whether this son was equal to the empire. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, this tension was to take on tragic significance. The many deaths in the family also had an effect on Marcus' thinking. When he later wrote that everything human passes away like smoke, dust, or a short dream, it was not an empty formula. He had lost children, seen relatives die, mourned friends, and finally lost Faustina. The imperial palace was not free of suffering. Perhaps it was precisely this experience that made his philosophy so forceful. The Stoa taught him to accept death as part of nature, but acceptance did not mean callousness. Marcus Aurelius wanted to order pain, not deny it. He wanted to remember that no one has a permanent right, not even the emperor and not his children. Marcus Aurelius' family life therefore shows a side of his personality that easily disappears behind the image of the philosopher-emperor. He was not only a thinker and ruler, but also a husband and father. He lived in a house full of expectations, births, illnesses, grief, and hope. He had to cultivate personal ties, while the public interpreted each of these ties politically. He had to be a father in a world in which a son could also be heir to the throne. He had to be a husband, while his wife was seen as a symbol of the empire. He had to feel grief without being paralyzed by it, because the state continued to expect decisions. Faustina and the imperial family made Marcus Aurelius' life more human, but also more complicated. They gave him closeness, descendants, and dynastic security, but they tied him even more closely to the expectations of power. In them, he encountered the deepest truth of the empire: even the most personal does not remain completely private. Love, marriage, birth, and death became part of the history of the empire. For a man who was inwardly searching for simplicity and truthfulness, this was a constant challenge. Thus, in the life of Marcus Aurelius, his marriage to Faustina stands between affection and politics, between family and reasons of state, between personal happiness and public duty. It shows that the power of an emperor was not only tested on battlefields and in Senate sessions, but also in his own house. There, where children died, rumors arose, hope was born, and the future of the empire lay in the arms of a mother. Marcus Aurelius learned in his family what his philosophy told him again and again: everything that man loves is transient. But precisely for this reason, he must meet what is entrusted to him with dignity, fidelity, and responsibility. 7. The death of Antoninus Pius and the beginning of a new reign. When Antoninus Pius died in March 161, one of the quietest and most stable reigns of the Roman Empire came to an end. For 23 years he had led the empire with a remarkable mixture of restraint, a sense of duty, and administrative diligence. For many people in the Roman Empire, his rule had almost become a symbol of an orderly world. The big cities flourished, the administration functioned, the borders seemed controllable, and the emperor himself appeared as a guarantor of permanence. But precisely because Antoninus had reigned so long and so quietly, his death was a moment of the greatest political importance. In Rome, they knew all too well from history that the death of an emperor was not simply a family event. It could be the beginning of insecurity, rivalry, and violence. Antoninus Pius died on his estate near Lorium, not in the midst of a dramatic civil war and not as a fallen ruler, but as an old man whose life and reign were nearing their natural end. Tradition describes his death with an almost symbolic calm. Even as he was dying, he is said to have given the watchword for the palace guard: equanimity. Whether this scene happened exactly as it did or was later idealized is less important than its meaning. It fits the image that was preserved of Antoninus. He was considered a man of order, moderation, and inner firmness. For Marcus, his adopted son and successor, this moment must have been a deep personal and political turning point. He lost not only the emperor, but the man who had shaped him over decades. Marcus Aurelius had learned under Antoninus what rule could look like if it was supported by patience, dignity, and moderation. He had seen how to deal with the Senate, how to examine legal cases, how to answer petitions, how to protect the finances of the empire, and how to exercise power without constantly flaunting it. But now he himself took the place of the teacher. What had previously been observation, preparation, and co-responsibility became the ultimate responsibility. From that moment on, Marcus could no longer stand behind Antoninus. He had to decide for himself. He had to sign himself. He had to bear for himself what followed from his decisions. The change of power was initially surprisingly orderly. This was not a coincidence, but the result of a long preparation. Antoninus had built Marcus up as his successor over the years. The Senate knew him, the administration knew him, the public knew him, and his rank in the imperial house was undisputed. Marcus was not some ambitious senator who suddenly made claims after the death of a ruler. He was the intended heir, adopted son of the emperor, son-in-law of the emperor, decorated several times, politically visible and morally highly respected. In a world where changes of power could be dangerous, this was invaluable. But Marcus Aurelius made a decision right at the beginning of his reign that was unusual and momentous. He insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, also receive imperial power. The Senate would apparently have recognized Marcus alone as emperor. He was the stronger candidate, the more experienced, and probably also the more respected. But Marcus did not want to break Hadrian's order of succession. Hadrian had once adopted Antoninus Pius on the condition that he adopt both Marcus and Lucius. Thus, both men had been integrated into the dynastic future. Marcus obviously saw himself bound by this order. He acted not only out of political calculation, but also out of a sense of duty and loyalty to the plan to which he himself owed his rise. This created a dual power that was new in this form. Rome had previously known co-regents, designated successors, and shared responsibilities, but two officially equal Augusti at the head of the empire were something special. Marcus and Lucius both held the highest imperial title, but in the actual perception Marcus remained the superior spirit and the formative authority. Lucius Verus was younger, less experienced, and differently inclined. He was not without ability, but he did not fit the image of the earnest philosopher and dutiful statesman that Marcus embodied. Nevertheless, his uprising was politically wise. It prevented possible rivalries, honored Hadrian's dynastic construction, and firmly integrated an important line of the imperial house into the new order. This decision shows a lot about Marcus Aurelius' character. Another man would have taken the opportunity to rule alone. The emperor's power was great enough to outshine a competitor or to give him only symbolic honors. Marcus, however, chose a path that limited his personal monopoly on power. From a Stoic point of view, this was logical. For him, power was not a possession that had to be jealously defended, but a task that was in the service of the common good. If the joint rule promised stability to the empire, then it was more important than its personal primacy. At the same time, this decision should not be romanticized. Marcus also knew that a bypassed Lucius or his followers could become dangerous in the long run. Morality and political reason went hand in hand here. The beginning of the new rule was marked by rituals that were decisive for the Roman order. Antoninus Pius was honored, his deification was pursued, his memory was publicly cultivated. Continuity was important. A new emperor not only had to legitimize himself, but also show that he stood in a valid tradition. Marcus could refer to Antoninus, to Hadrian, to the line of adoptive emperors, and to the image of a rule founded not on bloody usurpation, but on selection, virtue, and recognition. The veneration of the deceased Antoninus was therefore not only mourning, but politics. She said to the Reich, "The order is not broken. The good emperor has gone, but his legacy lives on." For Marcus Aurelius personally, this beginning must have been difficult. In his self-reflections, a man later appears again and again who calls himself to fulfill his duty, especially when fatigue, disgust, grief, or overwhelm threaten. Antoninus' death meant that Marcus finally stepped out of the role of the learner. He had his philosophical ideals, his years of preparation, and the example of his adoptive father. But none of this could relieve him of the burden of being the center of the empire himself. An emperor could hear advice, but in the end the decision remained with him. He could pray, think, weigh, and remember, but he could not share the responsibility, even if he had a fellow emperor. The first months and years of his reign quickly showed that the quiet world of Antoninus would not simply continue. Shortly after the change of power, the empire was challenged in the east. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival on the other side of the Euphrates, apparently used the transition at the top to attack Roman spheres of influence. Such moments were typical of ancient empires. When a ruler died, opponents checked whether the successor was strong enough. A change of power could appear as an opportunity. For Marcus, this was an early and serious test. He had hardly become emperor when he had to show that philosophical education and mild attitude should not be confused with political weakness. It was precisely here that it became clear that the rule of a philosopher could not consist of peaceful contemplation. Marcus might have hoped to continue Antoninus' calm administration, but history forced him into a different role. He had to wage war, move troops, appoint commanders, provide resources, and defend the dignity of Rome. Lucius Verus was sent to the east and took over the imperial presence in the war against the Parthians. Marcus initially stayed in Rome and held the central government together. This marked the beginning of a division of tasks that made sense at first glance. Lucius was able to gain military fame, while Marcus headed the administration, Senate, and imperial headquarters. But the beginning of the reign was not only tense in foreign policy. The new dual leadership also had to prove itself internally. How would senators react to two emperors? How would orders be formulated? Who had priority in case of doubt? Would courtiers try to play Lucius off against Marcus? Would the army recognize both equally? Such questions were not theoretical. In a monarchy based on personal authority, any ambiguity could be dangerous. Marcus therefore had to find a difficult path. He had to honor and involve Lucius without giving up the leadership of the empire. He had to show unity without creating weakness. He had to be a brother and at the same time remain the superior statesman. The Senate apparently received Marcus with respect. His reputation was excellent. He was considered educated, serious, just, and dutiful. For the senatorial elite, this was reassuring. In the experience of previous tyrannical emperors, many senators appreciated a ruler who did not appear arbitrary, cruel, or wasteful. Marcus' proximity to philosophy could act as a sign of inner moderation. But a good reputation was no protection against crises. An emperor was not only measured by his character, but by results. Could he secure borders? Could he pay for the army? Could he guarantee grain supply, justice, and public order? Could it withstand disasters? These questions would determine his rule. The death of Antoninus Pius thus marked the end of a long preparation and the beginning of a much harsher reality. Marcus did not run as a young, inexperienced man, but as a mature, thoroughly trained ruler of 40. He knew the administration, the Senate, the rituals of power, and the moral demands he made of himself. But he could not have known that his government would be marked by wars, epidemics, and border crises. He could not have guessed that his philosophy would not be put to the test in quiet palace hours, but in military camps, under pressure, and in the face of mass death. Perhaps this is precisely the tragedy and magnitude of this moment. When Marcus ascended the throne, he carried the legacy of a stable world. But soon he was to rule an empire that had been torn out of this stability. He wanted to preserve what Antoninus had given him. He wanted to be just, measured, dutiful, and reasonable. But history demanded more from him than administration. It demanded steadfastness under stress. The pupil of Antoninus became emperor at a time that was to force him to examine his whole thinking against reality. Thus, the reign of Marcus Aurelius began not with triumph, but with responsibility. Not with an ecstatic departure, but with a farewell. The death of Antoninus Pius was the moment when Marcus finally stood alone before the empire, even though Lucius Verus bore the title of emperor next to him. From now on, his philosophy was no longer preparation. It became a daily necessity. For the man who had learned to control himself now had to try to hold on to a world empire. 8. 2 emperors for one empire. When Marcus Aurelius became emperor in 161, he could have taken power alone. His position was strong, his reputation excellent, his preparation long and thorough. The Senate recognized him, the administration knew him, and in the imperial house his role as successor to Antoninus Pius had been consolidated for many years. No one would have been surprised if he had stepped alone to the head of the empire. But Marcus Aurelius made a different decision. He elevated Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, to co-emperor. This was the first time in Roman history that 2 men with the title of Augustus were officially at the head of the empire at the same time. This decision was unusual, courageous, and politically wise, but it also brought new questions. Can an empire that has been oriented towards the authority of one first man since Augustus be led by 2 emperors at the same time? And could such a division of power create stability without creating rivalry? The joint reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus did not come about by chance. Its roots lay in Hadrian's succession planning. When Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, he obliged him to adopt Marcus and Lucius again. In doing so, Hadrian not only wanted to secure the immediate transition, but also to order the next generation of the imperial house. Marcus embodied the line of the serious, educated, and morally highly respected successor. Lucius Verus, on the other hand, was the son of the earlier heir to the throne, Aelius Caesar, and brought with him his own dynastic significance. His involvement prevented this line from being excluded and possibly becoming a rallying point for dissatisfied forces. Marcus Aurelius' decision not to ignore Lucius was therefore not only a sign of personal loyalty, but also an act of political caution. Despite the formal equality, the two men were very different. Marcus Aurelius was 40 years old when he became emperor. He had spent decades at the court of Antoninus Pius, got to know administrative work, exercised political patience, and formed himself philosophically. He was considered serious, dutiful, reserved, and inwardly disciplined. Lucius Verus was younger and had a different temperament. He was later often described as more fun-loving, more representative, and less strict. While Marcus strove for moderation and inner self-examination, Lucius seemed more like a man of courtly splendor who enjoyed public recognition and social vitality. These contrasts did not necessarily have to be dangerous. They could also complement each other. But they made it clear that dual power was not simply a harmonious duplication of the same personality. For the empire, the new order initially had practical advantages. The Roman Empire was huge. No single person could personally survey all borders, provinces, military crises, legal issues, and political expectations. Even earlier emperors had recognized that such a large entity needed deputies, relatives, strong generals, and reliable administrators. Two emperors could theoretically react faster, show greater presence, and take on different tasks. One could stay in Rome to lead the administration, senate, and central decisions. The other could travel to a front to embody imperial authority. Especially at a time when news traveled slowly and military crises could arise far away, the personal presence of the emperor was of great importance. This division of labor soon became necessary. In the east, war broke out against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival on the other side of the Euphrates. The change of power after the death of Antoninus Pius had apparently given the impression that Rome could be vulnerable. The Parthian Empire intervened in Armenia, an area that lay between Roman and Parthian influence and was strategically and symbolically important for both sides. Armenia was not a remote fringe. Those who had influence there were able to expand their power in the border area between Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. For Rome, it was not just about land, but about prestige. If a new emperor accepted a Parthian advance, it could appear as a weakness. Lucius Verus was sent to the east to wage, or at least direct the war there as emperor. This decision made sense. Marcus remained in Rome and ensured the stability of the imperial headquarters, while Lucius took over the military role. Lucius should not necessarily be imagined as a general who personally planned every battle. The actual military execution was carried out by experienced commanders such as Avidius Cassius, Statius Priscus, and other Roman officers. But Lucius was the imperial face of the war. His presence showed the provinces, the army, and the enemy that Rome took the crisis seriously. In Roman politics, an emperor could be important even if he was not the best strategist himself. His person bundled authority. Roman troops regained Armenia, penetrated deep into Parthian territories, and captured important cities such as Seleucia and Ctesiphon. The victory brought fame, titles, and public prestige. Lucius Verus was able to appear as the victorious emperor, while Marcus maintained political order in Rome. To the outside world, the dual power was therefore quite successful. Two emperors had taken on two tasks, and the empire had proven its strength. But this success came at a high price. The troops returning from the east probably brought with them a severe plague, which later became known as the Antonine Plague. It was to shake the empire for years and shape the reign of Marcus Aurelius much more than any triumph. The dual power thus showed a deep ambivalence. On the one hand, it was able to make the Reich more capable of acting. On the other hand, she remained dependent on personal trust. Two emperors also meant two courts, two groups of followers, two opportunities for influence and misunderstandings. As long as Marcus and Lucius remained loyal to each other, the system worked. If one of them had developed ambition against the other, the situation would have become dangerous. The Roman Empire had a long memory of civil wars, usurpations, and rival centers of power. No one could be sure that shared power would remain permanently peaceful. In this case, however, Marcus Aurelius seems to have made a decisive contribution to stability through his attitude. He treated Lucius with respect and gave him honor without giving up the overall lead. Lucius Verus also seems to have accepted the primacy of Marcus Aurelius in essence. This was decisive for the peace of the rule. Formal equality had to be supplemented by an unspoken order in everyday life. Marcus was the older, more experienced, and more morally respected emperor. Lucius was given space for representation and military glory. Both were able to save face as a result. Such balances are sensitive in monarchical systems. Too much dominance of one would have humiliated the other. Too much independence on the part of the other would have created mistrust. The art was to show common ground without making power unclear. For Marcus Aurelius, this situation was also a philosophical test. The Stoa taught him not to cling to fame, possessions, and external superiority. But shared power is easier to advocate as long as the co-emperor remains loyal. Marcus had to trust that Lucius wouldn't be a danger. He had to avoid jealousy when Lucius received triumph and military honors after the Parthian War. He had to remember that it was not about personal greatness, but about the good of the empire. This is precisely where an important side of his character is revealed. Marcus Aurelius could have authority without taking any glory to himself. He was strong enough to make another visible next to him. At the same time, one must not idealize dual power. It did not solve the fundamental problems of the empire. The borders remained vulnerable, the military costs high, the administration cumbersome, and the question of succession unresolved in the long term. Two emperors could work on a problem faster, but they couldn't eliminate the structural tensions of a huge empire. In addition, it soon became clear that the major crises did not come individually. After the war in the east, the plague followed. After that, the Danube borders became more and more dangerous. The burden shifted from one region to the next. The empire needed not only two emperors, but constant adaptability. In 169, Lucius Verus died, presumably after an illness, while traveling with Marcus Aurelius in connection with the northern crises. His death ended the dual power after only 8 years. For Marcus, this meant the loss of a co-emperor and family member on the one hand, and on the other hand, the entire imperial responsibility now fell solely on him again. In retrospect, however, the joint rule shows that Marcus Aurelius' decision of 161 had not failed. There was no open break between the two Augusti, no civil war, no deadly rivalry. This alone was not a matter of course in Roman history. The significance of this dual power therefore lies not only in its novelty, but in what it reveals about the Roman Empire. The empire had become so large that the idea of a single omnipresent ruler became increasingly difficult. Later centuries were to produce more frequently divided models of rule, until finally several emperors administered different parts of the empire. In this sense, the joint government of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus was an early indication of a development that would later become much more important. The empire needed a presence in many places, but its political culture still depended heavily on personal unity. For Marcus Aurelius, the time with Lucius Verus was a transitional phase. He began his reign not alone, but in conscious fidelity to a dynastic order that had been designed before him. He showed that power could be shared when character, reason, and political caution worked together. But he also had to experience that even the smartest order does not protect against war, disease, and chance. The Parthian War brought glory, but also the plague. The dual power brought stability, but no lasting relief. In the end, Marcus was once again alone in the face of the growing crises of the empire. Thus, this chapter shows Marcus Aurelius not only as emperor, but as a man who did not understand power as personal possession. He could have ruled alone, but he chose involvement. He could have marginalized Lucius, but he gave him dignity. He could have claimed any fame for himself, but he gave the co-emperor his place. That was not a weakness. It was a special form of political strength. Because sometimes true power is not shown by not tolerating anyone next to you, but by being big enough to share responsibility. 9. The war against the Parthians. No sooner had Marcus Aurelius taken over the reign than the Roman Empire was challenged at one of its most sensitive borders. In the east, Rome had faced an opponent for generations who was not simply a local tribe, not a small king, and not an insignificant marginal power. The Parthian Empire was a great power with its own tradition, its own elite, its own military strengths, and a deep claim to influence in the border areas between the Euphrates, Armenia, and Mesopotamia. Since the late Republic, Rome and the Parthians had repeatedly wrestled with each other. Both empires knew that a direct fight was expensive, risky, and difficult to decide completely. And yet neither of them could permanently accept that the other was becoming too strong in the intermediate zones. Armenia in particular played a key role in this. This kingdom lay like a political hinge between the Roman provinces in the west and the Parthian sphere of influence in the east. Whoever controlled Armenia or was able to impose a dependent king there gained not only strategic depth, but also prestige. For Rome, Armenia was a shelter from Parthian influence on Syria and Cappadocia. For the Parthians, Armenia was equally important because it touched access to the Caucasus and the western border regions of their empire. Any change in the Armenian throne could therefore lead to a major crisis. It was not just about a king, but about the question of which great power had the last word in the east. After the death of Antoninus Pius in 161, the Parthian king Vologeses apparently believed that he saw a favorable opportunity. A change of power in Rome was always a moment of possible weakness. Even though Marcus Aurelius was well prepared and the succession was orderly, the new emperor first had to prove that he was not only educated, virtuous, and popular, but also militarily determined. The Parthians intervened in Armenia, put pressure on Roman influence there, and inflicted severe setbacks on Roman forces. This was dangerous for Rome. A new emperor who showed weakness in the east right at the beginning of his reign would have lost prestige not only in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy. Marcus Aurelius was thus faced with a test that actually contradicted his own inclination. He was not a man who sought war to gain glory. His spiritual world was characterized by duty, moderation, and self-control. But as emperor, he could not retreat to a private aversion to violence. The security of the empire, the prestige of Rome, and the loyalty of the provinces demanded an answer. A philosopher on the throne could not simply be peace-loving when an opponent tested the limits. He had to decide when indulgence was reasonable and when it was understood as weakness. In the east, Rome decided to go to war. The task of embodying the imperial presence in the east fell to Lucius Verus. Marcus Aurelius remained in Rome and held the central government together while his co-emperor was sent to the front. This decision shows the practical side of dual power. Two emperors were able to take on different tasks. Lucius was not necessarily the actual military head of the operations, but his presence had political significance. He was Augustus in the east, the visible sign that Rome took the Parthian challenge seriously. For soldiers, provincial elites, and allies, this presence was important. A war of this magnitude was not only a sequence of battles, but also a question of perception. The military work was mainly carried out by experienced Roman generals. Among them were men such as Statius Priscus and Avidius Cassius, who played a decisive role in the following years. Rome had a professional army capable of organizing large-scale operations over long distances. But the war in the east was difficult. The landscapes between Anatolia, Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia placed high demands on supplies, marching performance, and coordination. Legions had to be moved, supply routes secured, local alliances maintained and enemy movements observed. In such campaigns, it was not only the courage of individual soldiers that was decisive, but also the ability of an empire to move people, animals, money, weapons, and food over enormous spaces. First, the Romans had to restore the situation in Armenia. Statius Priscus succeeded in reasserting Roman power there. The capital Artaxata was captured, and a king friendly to Rome could be installed. This was an important goal. Rome showed that it did not accept the Parthian intervention. But the war did not end there. The Roman counteroffensive expanded. The fighting shifted to Mesopotamia, where Roman troops advanced deep into the Parthian sphere of influence. This expansion was risky, but it corresponded to the logic of imperial deterrence. Rome didn't just want to get back what was lost. It wanted to show the enemy that an attack on Roman interests would be expensive. Avidius Cassius was particularly prominent in this phase. He was a capable and energetic commander whose career gained considerable weight due to the Parthian War. Under his leadership, Roman troops advanced as far as important cities. Seleucia on the Tigris and the Parthian royal city of Ctesiphon were captured or severely hit. Such successes had enormous symbolic significance. Ctesiphon was not just any city. It stood for the power and dignity of the Parthian kingship. When Roman troops invaded it, it was a humiliation for the Parthians and a strong signal to the entire region. Rome was able to present itself as a victorious force of order that could still strike far to the east. But triumph and reality were close together. The war brought military success, but it demanded a high price. The soldiers fought far away from Italy, in foreign landscapes, under difficult climatic conditions, and in a space where care and illness were often as dangerous as the enemy. Ancient armies did not only suffer in battle. They suffered on marches, in camps, in besieged cities, with bad food, contaminated water, and exhaustion. Each great campaign could spread diseases because people from different regions came together and then spread out again across the empire. This is precisely where the dark consequence of the Parthian War lies. The returning troops probably brought with them a severe plague, which later became known as the Antonine Plague. Whether it was smallpox, measles, or another disease is still debated today. What is certain is that the disease had devastating effects. It spread to many parts of the empire, hitting towns, villages, camps, and families, and weakening the population as well as the army. This gave the victory in the east a tragic downside. Rome had triumphed militarily, but something returned from the war that no legion could easily defeat. For Marcus Aurelius, this connection was bitter. He had not sought war, but he had to let it be waged. He was able to use the success politically, but at the same time he had to bear the consequences. While Lucius Verus gained fame in the east, Marcus remained in Rome with the burden of the general government. He had to secure supplies, make decisions, involve the Senate, and at the same time process the news from the war. The distance between Rome and the front made everything more difficult. Messages were delayed, situation reports were incomplete, and each order took time. An emperor had to act under uncertainty. He had to trust men who made decisions far away. The Parthian War therefore also showed the limits of personal control in a world empire. Lucius Verus returned with great prestige after the successes in the east. The emperors were able to celebrate triumph and victory titles. This was important for the Roman audience. Victories confirmed the order. They showed that the new rulers were strong. Coins, titles, public celebrations, and honors turned military force into a political message. Rome had defeated its opponents, secured Armenia, and inflicted a heavy defeat on the Parthians. But behind this staging remained the question of what the victory was really worth. The Parthians were weakened, but not destroyed. The eastern border remained an area of rivalry in the future. And the plague that spread after the war was to shake the empire more deeply than the Parthian attack itself. The war against the Parthians shows Marcus Aurelius in a role that is often overshadowed by his philosophical reputation. He was not only the writing emperor who thought about transience. He was also a ruler who was responsible for military decisions. Even when he was not personally at the front, he bore political and moral responsibility. Every relocation of troops, every offensive, every siege, every decision about war and peace was ultimately part of the burden of his office. The Stoa could help him to sort out this burden inwardly, but it did not relieve him of it. Precisely for this reason, this war is a key to understanding his rule. Marcus Aurelius did not reign in a quiet epoch in which a philosopher could think about virtue undisturbed. He ruled in a world where great powers competed, borders were contested, and weakness could be exploited immediately. He had to accept that righteous intentions alone do not protect an empire. Sometimes responsibility demanded actions that were difficult to reconcile with personal aversion to violence. Marcus Aurelius lived in this contradiction as emperor. So the victory over the Parthians was a success, but not an easy triumph. He secured Rome's prestige, confirmed the new rule, and showed the power of the legions. At the same time, it opened the way to a catastrophe that no one had planned. Not only glory came back from the eastern campaigns, but also illness, death, and a new insecurity. The war began as a test of the young dual power and ended as a harbinger of a much greater crisis. For Marcus Aurelius, he was the first great proof that his reign would not be the quiet continuation of Antonine stability. The empire had triumphed in the east, but the price of this victory was to be felt for a long time to come. 10. The Antonine Plague. After the war against the Parthians, Roman soldiers returned from the east, laden with memories of victories, marching hardships, foreign cities, and the harshness of a long campaign. Rome had asserted its power, brought Armenia back under its influence, and dealt heavy blows to the Parthians. To the outside world, this war could appear as a triumph. The emperors had shown that the change of power after the death of Antoninus Pius did not mean weakness. The legions were still able to penetrate deep into enemy territory. The order of the empire seemed to be confirmed. But with the troops returning home, something came back that no triumphal inscription or victory title could hold. An illness began to spread, quietly at first, then with terrifying violence. It was to go down in history as the Antonine Plague and shake the reign of Marcus Aurelius more deeply than any single enemy on the borders. The term plague must not be understood hastily in the modern sense. Whether it was actually plague in the narrower medical sense is uncertain. Many researchers suspect a disease such as smallpox or possibly measles, because ancient descriptions report fever, rashes, and a severe course. The most important ancient voice is the physician Galen, who observed the disease and gave clues to its symptoms. However, the sources remain limited and do not allow a completely reliable diagnosis. For the people of the 2nd century, the exact medical classification was of secondary importance anyway. What mattered was that the disease was sudden, that it spread, and that it brought death to homes, camps, towns, and villages. The plague hit an empire that seemed strong, but was also vulnerable due to its size. The Roman Empire was closely linked by roads, trade routes, military movements, and maritime trade. It was precisely this connection, which meant strength in everyday life, that could become a danger in an epidemic. Soldiers marched from front to front, merchants traveled between ports, officials moved between provinces, pilgrims, slaves, envoys, and workers moved through the same space. What transported goods, messages, and orders also transported illness. The Roman infrastructure, which otherwise appeared as a sign of order, now became a network through which uncertainty could spread. For Marcus Aurelius, this epidemic was a challenge of a special kind. An external enemy could be fought. You could gather troops, fortify camps, organize supplies, send envoys, conclude treaties, or fight battles. There was no comparable strategy against an illness. An emperor could order sacrifices, support doctors, take public action, organize care, and urge the administration to act. But he couldn't stop the disease by willpower. Here Marcus encountered a power that put his Stoic worldview to the test. The Stoa taught that man cannot control everything. Now this doctrine became a political reality. The emperor of a world empire had to learn that even the highest power stops at the fragility of the body. The effects of the Antonine Plague were probably enormous. Exact numbers cannot be reliably determined, but the disease seems to have raged in various waves over the years. It affected the civilian population, but also the army. That was particularly dangerous. The legions were the backbone of the empire. When soldiers died, were weakened or could no longer be adequately replaced, the defensive capability of the borders suffered. At the same time, wars had to be fought, garrisons held, and new recruits procured. An epidemic was therefore not only a medical catastrophe, but also a military and economic problem. In the cities, the situation could become particularly bad. Rome and other large urban centers lived on close coexistence: grain supply, markets, public baths, and dense social movement. If a contagious disease gained a foothold there, it could quickly reach many people. Families lost relatives, workshops, workers, administrations, civil servants, manors, workers. The religious and moral interpretation of the crisis also played a major role. In a world where illness was often associated with divine wrath, disturbed order, or fateful trial, people searched for meaning. Sacrifices, prayers, and rituals were not merely outward acts, but attempts to restore the shattered relationship between men, gods, and the state. As emperor, Marcus Aurelius was also at the head of this religious order. The Roman ruler was not only a political decision-maker, but also Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest. He had to show that the empire was not headless. In times of an epidemic, people expect from him not only administration, but signs. He had to make care visible, radiate stability, and maintain the connection to the gods. This was a difficult task, because the disease undermined the very feeling that the world was in order. When people died en masse, when funerals increased, when doctors were overwhelmed, and when rumors circulated, even the emperor's authority could seem weaker. At the same time, the epidemic exacerbated existing burdens. The Parthian War had cost resources, and soon the Danube border was also to fall into a long crisis. An empire can often overcome a major challenge if the other structures remain stable. But Marcus Aurelius' rule became so difficult precisely because crises overlapped. Disease weakened the population and the army. Border conflicts demanded more soldiers and money. Economic losses made tax revenue and supply more difficult. Political responsibility thus became a constant weighing up under conditions of scarcity. Marcus didn't have to decide whether he wanted to choose ideal solutions. He had to decide what imperfect measures were possible under the circumstances. The Antonine Plague also changed the atmosphere of the rule. Under Antoninus Pius, the empire had given the impression of quiet duration. Now it became apparent how quickly security could break. An epidemic reminds people that power, wealth, and order are based on bodies that are vulnerable. The senator, the merchant, the soldier, the slave, the official, and the emperor himself were not fundamentally protected from illness. Of course, living conditions were different, and the rich had better care than the poor. But the epidemic could also affect the higher classes. She made it clear that death has no regard for rank. It is precisely this insight that resonates again and again in Marcus Aurelius' self-reflections. He remembers that fame passes, that the body disintegrates, that man acts only for a short time and then disappears. But these thoughts must not be understood as cold indifference. Marcus Aurelius' philosophy was not an attempt to gloss over suffering. It was an attempt not to break down inwardly in suffering. When he wrote about transience, it was not because he was indifferent to human lives, but because he had to uphold himself. An emperor who was confronted daily with news of death, pleas, military problems, and personal losses needed an inner order. The Stoa gave him sentences with which he could defend himself against despair, anger, and self-pity. She reminded him that his job was not to curse the inevitable, but to act justly within the scope of what was possible. The plague also had long-term consequences for the empire. It may have weakened demographics, reduced the workforce, strained the economy, and forced the state to find new ways of recruiting and financing. Especially at the borders, every loss could be felt. When entire units were weakened or there was a lack of men, gaps were created that opponents could exploit. On the Danube, Germanic and Sarmatian groups were increasingly on the move. These conflicts had their own causes, but a Rome weakened by disease was less flexible. So the plague was not to be considered in isolation. It was part of a chain of burdens that darkened the so-called Golden Age of the Empire. For the people of the empire, the epidemic must have created a deep sense of insecurity. In many families, grief became part of everyday life. Religious questions became more urgent. Doctors could help, but their options were limited. Ancient medicine knew observation, experience, and treatment methods, but no modern germ theory, no vaccinations, and no targeted epidemic control in the modern sense. One could alleviate symptoms, provide care, recommend diet, avoid or seek baths, adjust the air, food, and lifestyle, but one did not understand the disease in its microbiological cause. As a result, many things remained uncanny. An invisible danger was moving through the realm, and no one knew for sure where it would strike next. Lucius Verus may also have been indirectly part of this medical history. He died in 169, after returning from the eastern contexts and during the joint efforts against the northern threats. The exact cause of death is not certain, but his death occurred at a time when illness and military stress were shaping the empire. For Marcus Aurelius, this meant a further loss. The man whom he had raised to co-emperor was now gone, and the burden of power rested more heavily on his shoulders. The plague thus not only had anonymous victims, but also touched the top of power. In this dark time, Marcus Aurelius does not show himself to be a radiant victor, but a burdened ruler. His image as philosopher-emperor becomes particularly tangible here, not because he was above things, but because he tried to keep his composure in the midst of the crisis. He had to experience that an empire remained vulnerable despite all the roads, legions, laws, and temples. He had to accept that many things were out of his control, and yet he could not deduce inactivity from this. It was precisely the Stoic attitude that demanded that we accept the uncontrollable and resolutely do what can be controlled. The Antonine Plague was therefore more than a disease. It was a turning point in Rome's self-image. It showed that the order of the empire could not be taken for granted. It weakened the forces that Marcus Aurelius would have needed for future wars. It brought death into an era that had previously liked to see itself as stable and blessed. And it forced the emperor to use his philosophy not as a beautiful theory, but as a form of survival. In the end, there was no easy conclusion to this epidemic. Rome did not break up immediately. The empire continued to exist, the administration continued to work, the army continued to fight, and Marcus Aurelius continued to rule. But something had changed. The rule had become more difficult, the borders more threatening, the future more uncertain. The victory in the east had shown what Rome could still achieve. The plague showed what Rome could not control. For Marcus Aurelius, this experience became a bitter lesson about power and powerlessness. The emperor could give orders, enact laws, and move armies. But before illness, death, and transience, he too remained only a human being. 11. The Marcomannic Wars. The Marcomannic Wars became the most severe military test in the reign of Marcus Aurelius. After the war against the Parthians and after the devastating effects of the Antonine Plague, the Roman Empire would have needed rest. The army was under strain, the population of many regions was weakened, the economy was under pressure, and the administration had to deal with the consequences of years of crises. But just at that moment, a danger began to accumulate on the Danube, shaking the empire at one of its most important borders. What at first could seem like a series of regional border conflicts developed into a long, grueling war that continued Marcus Aurelius from Rome for years, forcing him to rule from camps. The Danube border was of enormous strategic importance for Rome. It did not form a rigid protective wall, but a lively, dangerous border area. On the Roman side were provinces such as Pannonia, Noricum, Rhaetia, and Moesia, important military zones, cities, camps, and transport routes. On the other side of the Danube lived various Germanic and Sarmatian groups, including Marcomanni, Quadi, Jazygen, and many other associations. These groups were not unitary states in the Roman sense. They consisted of tribal associations, retinues, princely groups, warrior elites, and dependent communities. Their politics were flexible, often characterized by personal ties, booty interests, pressure from neighbors, and changing alliances. Rome could conclude treaties with them, give gifts, trade, or make military threats. But permanent control remained difficult. In the 2nd century, these northern areas began to move more and more. The reasons were complex. Migration movements further east and north probably played a role, as did competition between tribal groups, population pressure, the desire for access to Roman wealth, and perhaps also the weakening of Roman deterrence through plague and troop deployments. For the peoples on the other side of the Danube, Rome was both an opponent and a magnet. The empire had money, weapons, luxury goods, grain, markets, and prestige. Those who were allowed to trade with Rome or received Roman support could strengthen their position among neighbors. Those who were excluded or came under pressure, on the other hand, could try to force access to resources by force. Marcus Aurelius was thus faced with a problem that could not be solved with a single battle. The Marcomannic Wars were not a clear campaign against a centrally controlled enemy whose capital could be captured and whose king could be forced to capitulate. It was a chain of conflicts, incursions, alliances, punitive expeditions, negotiations, and new outbreaks of violence. It was precisely this that made the war so difficult. Rome was used to clear structures, provinces, governors, treaties, cities, roads, camps. On the other side of the Danube, however, it encountered a political world in which power was more closely tied to individuals, followers, and warrior groups. Even if a chief or king made a treaty, this did not necessarily mean that all groups obeyed permanently. The crisis became particularly dramatic when Germanic groups crossed the Danube and penetrated deep into Roman territory. This was a shock for Rome. For a long time, Italy itself had not experienced a serious attack by foreign warriors. Now enemy groups reached the northern Italian region and threatened, among other things, Aquileia, an important city near the Adriatic. This threat hit the Roman self-image hard. The heartland of the empire was considered protected by provinces, legions, and the natural distance to the borders. If enemies were able to penetrate as far as northern Italy, it showed that the crisis was not just a problem of distant garrisons. It touched the core of Roman security. Marcus Aurelius had to react. He was not a young conqueror seeking military glory, and yet he was now becoming an emperor in the field. He left Rome and spent large parts of his later reign on the Danube front. This step was politically and militarily necessary. The presence of the emperor could motivate troops, secure loyalty, give weight to negotiations, and show the provinces that they were not left alone. In the Roman world, imperial presence was more than administration. She was a symbol. When the emperor appeared in the camp, it became clear that war had the highest priority. The military situation was difficult. The Antonine Plague had probably also weakened the army. Rome had to replenish troops, create new units, relocate soldiers from other regions, and possibly also take unusual recruitment measures. An empire that experienced disease, economic strain, and border war at the same time had to improvise. Marcus Aurelius even sold parts of the imperial possessions to raise funds for the war. This step shows how serious the situation was. The emperor not only resorted to taxes and state funds, but also made it clear that the imperial family also had to make sacrifices. For a ruler who emphasized simplicity and duty, this suited his self-image. For him, power meant not only entitlement, but responsibility. The Roman strategy consisted of several levels. First of all, the invading groups had to be pushed back and the Danube border stabilized. This was followed by punitive expeditions across the river to weaken the enemy, take hostages, force treaties, and restore Roman deterrence. Rome tried to play off individual groups against each other, to form alliances, to grant settlement rights, or to take warriors into Roman service. Diplomacy and violence were close together. A treaty could be made by threat, a military defeat could be concluded by negotiation, and a defeated opponent could be used again tomorrow as an ally. For Marcus Aurelius, this war meant a constant moral tension. He wrote about humanity, reason, and the community of all people, but he had to give orders in a war that entailed death, destruction, and displacement. The Stoa taught him to fulfill his duty within the framework of his role. As emperor, his role was to defend the empire. But this duty was not pure. It brought with it tough decisions. Should enemy groups be destroyed, resettled, or integrated? Should one show leniency or toughness to deter further attacks? Should Rome create new provinces on the other side of the Danube in order to permanently shift the border to the north, or would that overwhelm the forces of the empire? Such questions show that Marcus Aurelius did not act in a simple world of good and evil. He ruled in a world where every decision had consequences, and even the most sensible choice could cause suffering. The Marcomannic Wars were also psychologically stressful. Military camps, cold, illness, bad news, long absences from Rome, and constant uncertainty shaped everyday life. The emperor no longer lived in the center of Roman culture, but on a front where the fragility of the empire became visible. It was precisely in this environment that many thoughts of his self-reflections arose. That's crucial. These texts are not the quiet notes of a man who had withdrawn from the world. They were created in a world of orders, military pressure, news of deaths, and political concern. When Marcus Aurelius admonishes himself to remain calm, to bear with people, to do one's duty and not to fear death, then these are not abstract exercises. They are inner survival sentences of a ruler in war. A particularly famous motif from this time is the so-called rain miracle. During a campaign, Roman troops were supposedly in great distress due to thirst and enemy pressure, until a sudden thunderstorm saved them and at the same time confused the opponents. Different traditions interpreted this event differently. Some saw it as divine help for Marcus Aurelius. Others later associated it with Christian soldiers. Historically, it is difficult to separate what was an actual weather event, religious interpretation, and political propaganda. But it is precisely this story that shows how much war was also understood religiously in the ancient world. A victory was not only a military success, but could also be interpreted as a sign of divine approval. Such stories were valuable for the morale of the troops and the public presentation of the emperor. In the course of the wars, Rome achieved several successes. The Marcomanni, Quadi, and Jazyges were pushed back, treaties were concluded, prisoners were repatriated, and Roman control over the Danube border was gradually restored. But the war did not end quickly. Fights flared up again and again. New decisions had to be made again and again. Marcus Aurelius seems to have considered creating new provinces on the other side of the Danube, possibly with names such as Marcomannia and Sarmatia. Such a measure would have pushed the border forward and brought the dangerous tribal areas more under Roman control. Whether this plan was really close to implementation remains controversial in research, but it shows the strategic way of thinking. Rome not only wanted to react, but also to contain the causes of the threat in the long term. These plans were terminated by Marcus Aurelius' death in 180. His son Commodus soon made peace and abandoned the expansive strategy. In retrospect, this was often seen as a mistake, the beginning of a weaker border policy. But you have to judge carefully. The wars had cost Rome enormous strength. The army was exhausted, the finances were strained, the population weakened by epidemic and war. A permanent advance beyond the Danube would have required new garrisons, roads, administration, and years of occupation. Perhaps Marcus Aurelius' plan was strategically far-sighted, but perhaps it was hardly sustainable. Commodus opted for relief, not further expansion. Whether this was cowardly or pragmatic depends on what limits one believes the Reich is capable of. For Marcus Aurelius himself, the Marcomannic Wars were the central experience of his late reign. They did not make the philosopher-emperor a peaceful sage on an ideal throne, but an old, exhausted ruler in a military state of emergency. He had to lead soldiers, trust generals, punish enemies, conclude treaties, demand sacrifices, and at the same time try not to brutalize inside. This is precisely where the tragic greatness of his figure lies. He wanted to be just, but he ruled in a time that demanded harshness. He sought peace, but lived in war. He thought about the common reason of all people while fighting against people whom Rome saw as a threat. The Marcomannic Wars also show that the Roman Empire under Marcus Aurelius was at a turning point. It was still strong enough to repel heavy attacks and fight back militarily. But it was no longer invulnerable. Borders could be breached, Italy could be threatened, resources were finite, and crises no longer came individually. War, illness, financial pressure, and succession issues combined to form a burden that darkened the image of the golden imperial era. Marcus Aurelius was able to hold the empire, but he could not completely remove the signs of the difficulties to come. Thus, the Marcomannic Wars became the touchstone of his life. In them, he had to show whether his philosophy held up even under mud, blood, frost, and fear. Not in the lecture hall, not in the palace, not in a quiet library, but on the Danube, among banners, wounded, messengers, and hostile movements, Marcus Aurelius's thinking was put to the test. He passed this test not as a flawless hero, but as a man who, despite fatigue and contradiction, continued to do his duty. And perhaps that is exactly the reason why his figure still has such a strong effect today. He was not an emperor who loved war. He was an emperor who had to carry it. 12. The philosopher in the camp. Marcus Aurelius is one of the few rulers in world history whose inner life is known to us not only through the reports of others, but also through his own thoughts, which have been preserved to this day. His self-reflections are among the most famous philosophical texts of antiquity, but they were not written in a peaceful academy, not in a quiet garden, and not at a comfortable distance from political reality. Many of these thoughts were written down in an environment that could hardly seem more contrary to the calm philosophy. In the camp, during the wars on the Danube, between military decisions, illness, exhaustion, news of death, and constant concern for the Reich. It is precisely this contrast that makes Marcus Aurelius so fascinating. He wrote about inner peace while there was unrest around him. He urged himself to be lenient while he had to wage war. He thought about transience while people were dying every day. The self-reflections were not originally intended for the public. They were not a political program, a speech to the Senate, and not a work with which Marcus Aurelius sought to secure his posthumous fame. They were more of an inner exercise book, a conversation with oneself, a collection of memories, admonitions, and mental disciplines. This is precisely why they have such an immediate effect. Marcus Aurelius does not write like a man who wants to impress others. He writes like someone who has to keep himself awake. He remembers not to get angry, not to fall into self-pity, to endure other people's mistakes, not to fear death, and to fulfill one's duty without complaint. In these sentences, one does not feel the abundance of a man who has time to think, but the pressure of a ruler who might break inside without such thoughts. The Stoic philosophy that shaped Marcus Aurelius was not an abstract theory for him. It was a daily practice. The Stoa taught that man cannot completely control external events. It cannot prevent illness from breaking out, from other people from acting unjustly, from enemies from attacking, from friends from dying, or from aging one's own body. What he can test, however, is his judgment of these things and his answer to them. For Marcus Aurelius, this doctrine was particularly important because hardly any other person of his time possessed so much external power and at the same time had to experience so clearly how limited power is. He could enact laws, command armies, determine taxes, and decide on careers. But he could not prevent the plague from sweeping through the empire. He could not avoid every border conflict. He could not make all people good. He could not even secure his own life permanently. In the camp, this truth became tangible. There, the emperor was not surrounded by the gleaming facade of Rome, but by the harsh reality of power. The Danube front meant cold mud, marching orders, wounded, scouting reports, uncertain alliances, and long waiting times. A field camp was a place of discipline, but also of tension. Soldiers hoped for pay, supplies, and victory. Officers expected decisions. Envoys from enemy groups negotiated, threatened, or pleaded. News from other parts of the empire arrived late. The emperor had to act in an atmosphere in which one wrong step could cost lives. In such moments, philosophy was not unworldly, but necessary for survival. It gave him an inner order where the outer world seemed disordered. Marcus Aurelius kept reminding himself that he was first a man and then an emperor. This insight was not self-evident for a Roman ruler. The empire could easily drive a man into a dangerous illusion. Those who are constantly honored, who are surrounded by servants, who give orders and receive obedience, can begin to think of themselves as more than human. Roman culture itself contributed to this, because deceased emperors could be deified, their images stood in temples, their names were stamped on coins, their decisions had religious and political significance. Marcus Aurelius knew about this danger. His self-reflections therefore often seem like a deliberate counter-movement against the megalomania of power. He remembers that Alexander the Great and his muleteer also share the same death in the end. He places the glory of rulers next to the transience of all things. He takes away the illusion of being irreplaceable. This humility was not weakness. On the contrary, it was a form of strength for him. An emperor who considers himself infallible becomes dangerous. He no longer listens, confuses his will with justice, and sees contradiction as an insult. Marcus Aurelius was looking for a different way. He wanted to control himself before he dominated others. He knew that anger, vanity, laziness, and contempt for humanity can become particularly destructive in the ruler. An ordinary person who acts in anger may harm his family or environment. An emperor who acts in anger can have people executed, intensify wars, or punish entire groups. Therefore, for Marcus Aurelius, self-control was not a private virtue, but a political necessity. But this was precisely where the tension of his life lay. He thought about humanity, but he ruled an empire based on violence, hierarchy, and military control. He wrote about the community of all rational beings, but he waged war against peoples beyond the Danube. He exhorted himself to be mild, but he had to deter enemies and restore Roman authority. These contradictions cannot be easily resolved. Marcus Aurelius was not a modern pacifist who happened to sit on a throne. He was a Roman emperor, and his idea of duty was inextricably linked to the defense of the empire. For him, humanity did not mean renouncing domination, but acting as rationally and justly as possible within one's role. From today's perspective, this remains problematic, but this is precisely where the historical truth of his figure lies. He was a morally struggling man within a harsh world order, not outside of it. Self-reflection shows this struggle again and again. Marcus Aurelius challenges himself to put up with people who lie, push their way forward, are ungrateful, or act out of ignorance. He remembers that such people do not arise out of nothing, but are part of human nature. Those who are outraged by them forget that they also have faults themselves. These thoughts are particularly impressive when you combine them with your office. An emperor met daily supplicants, flatterers, schemers, ambitious officials, impatient officers, and disappointed subjects. He could easily have become bitter or contemptible. Philosophy was supposed to prevent him from doing so. It should remind him that people don't get better if you hate them, and that your character is more important than the faults of others. At the same time, Marcus Aurelius' thinking was strongly influenced by the awareness of transience. Again and again he sees human life as short, fleeting, and uncertain. Bodies are crumbling, names are disappearing, fame is fading, cities are changing, and even great empires are part of a larger natural process. For an emperor, this thought could be comforting and frightening at the same time. Comforting because he relativized the burden. Even the most serious crisis is part of a larger whole. Even one's own pain will pass. Frightening, because it showed that even Rome did not have to be eternal. Marcus Aurelius still lived in a powerful empire, but he felt, perhaps more clearly than many before him, that stability could not be taken for granted. The plague, The wars and the exhaustion of the borders made the fragility of the empire visible. His philosophy was therefore not a retreat from history, but a kind of inner counterweight to history. While events urged him, he tried not to be swept away by them. While the world made him emperor, he remembered to be only a part of nature. While people honored him, he thought that praise would soon fall silent. As he decided on others, he examined himself. This constant self-examination explains why Marcus Aurelius still works differently from many other rulers today. He not only asked himself the question of how he could secure power, he asked himself how he could remain a decent person under power. However, this self-examination should not be confused with uncertainty in the simple sense. Marcus Aurelius was not a weak ruler who lost himself in brooding. He waged war for years, made tough decisions, organized finances, negotiated with enemies, and held the empire together during a difficult time. His philosophy did not prevent him from acting. It was intended to purify his actions. It was to prevent him from acting out of hatred instead of duty, out of a lust for glory instead of necessity, or out of fear instead of reason. We cannot know whether he always succeeded in doing so. He himself would probably have said that he failed again and again, and therefore had to start again and again. It is precisely this imperfection that makes him human. In self-reflection, no man speaks who believes that he has finally reached wisdom. A man speaks who must remind himself of what he actually knows. He knows the teachings of the Stoa, but he has to repeat them. He knows that anger is useless, but he must arm himself against anger. He knows that fame is transient, but he must protect himself against the temptation of fame. He knows that death is natural, but he has to get used to this truth again and again. These repetitions are not a sign of mental weakness, but a sign of real practice. For him, philosophy is not a thought that you understand once, but an attitude that you have to practice every day. In the field camp, this exercise became particularly urgent. There, Marcus Aurelius was surrounded not only by enemies, but also by the loneliness of the highest responsibility. An emperor could have many advisors, but no one could completely relieve him of the last burden. If a decision failed, he bore its shadow. When soldiers died, it happened in his war. If negotiations failed, he had to give new orders. When the population suffered from taxes and recruitment, it was in the name of securing the Reich. The self-reflections perhaps also show the loneliness of a man who had to speak inwardly, because there was hardly anyone to whom he could show himself completely openly. This image of the writing emperor on the Danube is one of the strongest images in Roman history. Outside there was a kingdom under pressure, inside a man who called himself to reason. Marcus Aurelius did not write to explain to the world how great he was. He wrote to remind himself not to become smaller than his task. In an environment that demanded toughness, he did not want to harden. In a position that favored pride, he wanted to remain humble. In a time full of death, he did not want to suppress death, but to understand it. In a world full of duty, he did not want to forget that duty can become empty without humanity. That is why Marcus Aurelius is so effective to this day. Not because his rule was free of errors, not because his time was peaceful, and not because his philosophy solved all contradictions, but because it makes these contradictions visible. He shows that power and morality do not easily go together. He shows that inner peace does not mean not experiencing crises, but not losing control of oneself in crises. It shows that even on the highest throne, a person remains vulnerable, doubtful, and mortal. The philosopher in the camp is therefore not a romantic figure, but a deeply serious one. Marcus Aurelius did not think about life because life was easy for him. He thought about it because it was hard. His self-reflections are the document of an emperor who tried to maintain a quiet inner voice in the midst of the noise of history. And perhaps this is precisely where his greatest legacy lies. He reminds us that true greatness does not consist in being spared from the world, but in not losing one's own soul under its pressure. 13. Rule between duty and hardship. Marcus Aurelius is still considered one of the noblest rulers in Roman history. His name evokes the image of an emperor who was not characterized by megalomania, cruelty, or unbridled selfishness, but by duty, reason, and philosophical self-examination. But it is precisely this image that can be deceiving if you understand it too smoothly. Marcus Aurelius was not a saint on a throne, nor was he an unworldly thinker who happened to rule over an empire. He was Roman emperor in a time of heavy burdens. He had to manage a huge empire, defend borders, raise money, administer justice, prevent riots, secure religious order, and make decisions that were painful for many people. His rule therefore constantly moved between moral demands and political harshness. The most important basis of his actions was a sense of duty. For Marcus Aurelius, rule was not a private distinction, but a task that had fallen to him through his origin, adoption, upbringing, and fate. In his Stoic way of thinking, every person had a role in the big picture. The soldier had to act as a soldier, the father as a father, the citizen as a citizen, and the emperor as emperor. This role could not be left out of comfort, fatigue, or personal dislike. This is precisely why Marcus Aurelius could not simply be the quiet philosopher he might have liked to be in another life. He had to govern, even if governing exhausted him. He had to judge, even if sentences caused suffering. He had to wage war, even if war contradicted his inner search for moderation and humanity. The administration of the empire demanded an infinite succession of decisions. Reports, petitions, complaints, legal questions, and demands came from all provinces. Cities asked for tax breaks, officials reported riots, provinces needed military protection, communities demanded privileges, individuals sought mercy or justice. The emperor was not only a symbolic figure, but also the highest decision-making authority. Marcus Aurelius took this work seriously. He was considered a careful judge, a man who examined files, weighed arguments, and was not easily driven by whim or anger. This side of his rule fits well with his philosophical self-image. Justice was not just a slogan for him. It was a daily exercise in listening, weighing, and deciding. But Roman law was not modern in today's sense. It was based on a hierarchical society in which rank, status, gender, and freedom played an enormous role. Senators, knights, citizens, freedmen, non-citizens, and slaves were not immediately faced with the social reality of law. An emperor could act more leniently or harshly within this order, but he did not fundamentally question the order itself. Marcus Aurelius thought much about the common nature of all human beings, but he remained a ruler of the Roman Empire, whose economy and households continued to be based on slavery, dependence, and social inequality. This reveals an important contradiction. His philosophy had a universal language. His politics remained within the boundaries of the ancient world. This does not mean that his rule was inconsequential or hypocritical. On the contrary, it was precisely within this harsh order that it made a difference whether an emperor acted moderately, cruelly, arbitrarily, or responsibly. Marcus Aurelius apparently strove for regulated procedures, for the protection of certain weaker parties, and for a jurisdiction that did not only serve quick advantage. But he was not a revolutionary. He did not want to fundamentally reshape the empire, but to administer it more justly, as far as his idea of order and duty allowed. His morale was low, but it was Roman. It aimed at self-control, fair administration, and responsibility, not at a complete dissolution of social hierarchies. The tension between duty and harshness is particularly clear in his financial policy. The many wars, the plague, and the border crises cost enormous sums. Legions had to be paid, equipped, and cared for. Fortresses had to be held, roads secured, new troops recruited, and allies supported. An emperor could not rule with good thoughts alone. He needed money. Marcus Aurelius therefore had to procure funds without overtaxing the empire internally. It is famous that he had parts of the imperial property auctioned off to cover war costs. This measure suited his image as a dutiful ruler, because it showed that it was not only the population that should make sacrifices. The emperor himself put imperial luxury at the service of the state. But even such gestures could not cancel out the harshness of the situation. Taxes, recruitment, and economic burdens affected people throughout the empire. Anyone who lost a son to the army, who had to pay higher taxes, or who saw their existence threatened by war and epidemic experienced rule not only as a moral ideal. For many, the state was a demanding power. Marcus Aurelius had to make these demands because he wanted to defend the empire. But defending the empire often meant suffering for individuals. This shows a truth of political power. Even a good ruler can have to make decisions that are hard for many. Another difficult area was dealing with religious groups, especially Christians. At the time of Marcus Aurelius, Christians were still a minority, but a conspicuous and often suspicious one. The Roman Empire was religiously diverse and could tolerate many cults side by side, as long as they did not disturb public order and respected traditional forms of loyalty. Christians, however, refused to perform certain acts of sacrifice and distanced themselves from parts of the public cult practice. For Roman authorities, this could seem like a dangerous stubbornness, not necessarily because Christians were politically powerful, but because religion, state, and social order were closely linked. Anyone who refused to make sacrifices seemed like someone who evaded the common order. Under Marcus Aurelius, there were persecutions and executions of Christians in various regions. For example, in Lyon in 177. The exact personal responsibility of the emperor for individual measures is difficult to determine. The Reich was not always centrally controlled with a uniform persecution program against Christians. Much depended on local authorities, complaints, public pressure, and regional situations. Nevertheless, the fact remains that such persecutions took place during his reign, and that Marcus Aurelius apparently did not develop a fundamental policy of protection for Christians. For modern admirers of the philosopher-emperor, this is uncomfortable. A man who emphasized mildness and humanity ruled an empire in which people could suffer and die because of religious refusal. Here, too, one must remain historically sober. Marcus Aurelius did not think like a modern representative of religious freedom. For him, religion was part of public order. The gods, the rituals, the sacrifices, and loyalty to the state belonged together. A group that refused to conform to this structure could appear as a disturbance. This does not make persecution just, but it explains why an otherwise moderate ruler did not necessarily understand such harshness as a contradiction to his duty. His humanity had limits, and these limits were the limits of his time, his political role, and his Roman thinking of order. In foreign policy, and especially on the Danube, the tension became even sharper. Marcus Aurelius wanted to act sensibly, but he had to fight against groups that invaded Roman territory or threatened Roman security. He had to conclude treaties, take hostages, carry out punitive actions, move troops, and force enemies to submit. The Roman peace order was not based on equal rights for all peoples, but on Roman superiority. When Rome made peace, that peace was often the result of military pressure. Marcus Aurelius could proceed more moderately or more severely, but he remained the representative of an imperial power. His duty was first and foremost to the Reich, not to a neutral humanity. This is precisely why his philosophical thinking is so interesting. He knew that all people are part of the same nature, and yet, as emperor, he had to distinguish between Romans, subjects, allies, and enemies. He could admonish himself not to hate other people, but he could not refrain from waging war against them when he saw the empire threatened. He did not release this tension by retreating, but by a kind of inner separation. The action had to be hard when duty demanded it, but the soul was not to be dominated by hatred. You can fight an enemy without letting yourself be poisoned by anger inside. One can inflict punishment without enjoying cruelty. At least that was the ideal that Marcus Aurelius followed. Whether he always lived up to this ideal is another question. No ruler can be fully understood by his own writings. The self-reflections show how Marcus Aurelius wanted to be and what he remembered. They do not show every decision, not every sacrifice of his policies, and not every harshness of his administration. Therefore, he must be seen twice, as a person with serious moral aspirations and as the emperor of an empire based on power. He was neither merely a noble sage nor merely an ordinary ruler. He was both at the same time, and this is precisely where the historical tension of his character arises. This balance was also evident in his dealings with the Senate. Marcus Aurelius apparently sought a respectful relationship with the senatorial elite. He avoided the open humiliation that some previous emperors had practiced and cultivated the impression of shared responsibility. But the real power still lay with the emperor. The Senate could be honored, but it was not the sovereign. Marcus Aurelius therefore had to maintain a political form that suggested republican dignity, while reality remained monarchical. This too was a kind of Roman double-bottom. There was talk of tradition, offices, and common order, but in the end the princeps decided. A moderate emperor made this tension bearable. A cruel emperor made them dangerous. Marcus Aurelius belonged to the first group, but he did not change the structure of power. His personal work ethic impressed many. He took duty seriously, even when he was sick, tired, or burdened by war. In his thoughts, he admonishes himself to get up in the morning and do a person's work. This sentence seems simple, but for an emperor it had great weight. It means, do not flee from the task, even if it is difficult. Don't complain about what you've been assigned. Do what reason demands. This attitude gave dignity to his rule. It may have prevented many forms of arbitrariness and self-indulgence that could easily arise with absolute power. But duty can also be hard. Anyone who always asks what is necessary can run the risk of overlooking the individual suffering behind the great task. Marcus Aurelius fought against this danger, but he could not escape it completely. Maintaining an empire means prioritizing interests. The security of the border could become more important than sparing a hostile village. The financing of the army could become more important than the relief of individual taxpayers. Public order could become more important than the freedom of a religious minority. This is the dark side of every reason of state. Marcus Aurelius tried to limit her morally, but he lived off her. In the end, this is precisely why his reign is so instructive. It shows that good intentions alone are not enough when a person is at the head of a huge power order. Character is important, but it does not remove the constraints of political responsibility. Marcus Aurelius was probably a better emperor than many others because he examined himself, because he sought moderation, and because he put duty above personal luxury. But his rule also remained part of a world in which violence, inequality, and coercion seemed inevitable. The philosopher-emperor could govern the empire in a more humane way, but he could not transform it into a realm of pure humanity. Thus, Marcus Aurelius stands between admiration and critical observation. He was a ruler who sought justice but exercised harshness. He was a philosopher who saw all people as part of a common order, but as emperor he fought enemies and did not protect religious deviation in the modern sense. He was a man of self-control, but also a monarch with enormous power. His greatness does not lie in the fact that he overcame all contradictions. His greatness lies in the fact that he took them seriously and did not take refuge comfortably in cruelty, vanity, or indifference. Marcus Aurelius' reign between duty and harshness shows a man who wanted to do the right thing without always living in a world in which the right thing was clear. He had to act, even though every action could cast shadows. He had to defend the empire, although defense meant violence. He had to administer justice, even though the law of his time was unequal. He had to keep order, although order often required coercion. And as he did all this, he kept reminding himself that he was mortal, fallible, and sworn to reason. It is precisely this mixture of power, morality, and imperfection that makes him one of the most impressive figures of antiquity. 14. Commodus and the question of succession. The question of succession was never just a family affair in the Roman Empire. It was one of the most dangerous political issues of all. Every emperor had to deal with it sooner or later, because his death could not lead to chaos, civil war, or military rivalry. Rome did not have a simple, undisputed rule of inheritance, as later monarchies developed. The emperor could prepare his successor, adopt him, appoint him Caesar, endow him with honors, and introduce him to power. But in the end, the Senate, the army, the court, and the provinces had to accept the new order. A poorly regulated transition could jeopardize everything a ruler had built. For Marcus Aurelius, this question became particularly difficult because he himself was the product of a successful adoption, but in the end he made his own son Commodus his successor. Marcus Aurelius had come to power through a system that in retrospect seems almost ideal. Nerva had adopted Trajan. Trajan had left Hadrian as his successor. Hadrian had adopted Antoninus Pius, who in turn had adopted Marcus and Lucius Verus. This series was later often regarded as the time of the so-called good emperors, because it apparently did not blindly follow blood relations, but selected suitable men. Of course, this image was also simplified. Adoptions were not purely virtue decisions, but part of power politics, dynastic planning, and aristocratic interests. Nevertheless, this system had a decisive advantage. It enabled a childless or politically astute emperor to build up an adult, experienced, and recognized successor. Marcus Aurelius himself benefited from this. He was prepared, trained, observed, and introduced to the rule over decades. When Antoninus Pius died, Marcus was not an unknown young man, but a mature, respected, and politically trained successor. This is precisely why his decision in favor of Commodus seems so problematic in retrospect. Commodus was his natural son, born in 161, the first year of Marcus Aurelius' reign. From the beginning, he was not just a child, but a dynastic sign. His birth took place at a time when the new rule needed stability. A son could promise continuity. In the Roman public, the existence of a male heir was of great importance. It gave the imperial house a future, calmed expectations, and reduced the risk of different groups building up their own candidates at an early stage. For Marcus Aurelius as his father, Commodus was a child. For Marcus Aurelius as emperor, Commodus was also a political promise. This dual role made the question of succession so difficult. An emperor couldn't just look at his son like any aristocrat. As soon as an emperor's son existed, an expectation arose around him. Courtiers, soldiers, senators, and provinces watched him. His rank was made visible, his future interpreted, his upbringing politically charged. If Marcus Aurelius had bypassed Commodus, it would not have been a neutral act. It would have triggered questions. Why is the son not considered? Is he incompetent? Is there a court party against him? Who should come instead? Would supporters of Commodus accept another solution? Especially in a time of severe wars and uncertainty, an open break with dynastic expectations could be dangerous. Marcus Aurelius had many children, but only a few reached adulthood. The constant losses within his family must have shaped his view of succession and bloodline. In a world of high infant mortality, a surviving son was not a matter of course. Commodus therefore became important not only out of personal affection, but also because he offered a rare dynastic security as a living male heir. For an empire that was just being shaken by plague, war, and border crises, continuity could seem valuable even if the inheritance was not ideal. Stability was not always the choice of the best, but often the avoidance of the most dangerous. Commodus was involved in the succession at an early stage. He received titles, honors, and public visibility. As a child, he became part of the imperial representation. Later he was elevated to Caesar and finally to Augustus, i.e. co-emperor. Thus, his succession had not suddenly emerged on the deathbed of Marcus Aurelius, but had been built up over years. This corresponded to Roman practice. A future ruler had to be visible. The army was to know his name, the Senate to recognize his position, the provinces to see his pictures on coins, and the court to adjust to him. Through this gradual uprising, Commodus became accustomed to power, but also the political world to Commodus. The crucial question is, what did Marcus Aurelius know about his son's character? Later sources paint Commodus in gloomy colors. They describe him as vain, cruel, wasteful, narcissistic, dependent on minions, and obsessed with gladiator games. Under his rule, relations with the Senate deteriorated, and his appearance as a fighting emperor in the arena destroyed the dignity of the principate in the eyes of many elites. But you have to be careful. Many reports about Commodus come from a senatorial perspective, which sharply condemned him after his death. Nevertheless, it is hard to deny that his government meant a clear break with his father's style. The question remains whether Marcus Aurelius could have foreseen this development. Commodus was still very young when his father died. He was about 19 years old. A character can still seem unformed at this age, and a father can hope that responsibility will mature. Marcus Aurelius himself had been shaped by long education, teachers, role models, and duties. Perhaps he believed that Commodus would also grow through the right environment, through advisors, and through the burden of the office. Perhaps he saw weaknesses, but hoped they could be controlled. Perhaps he underestimated how dangerous a young emperor could become when he was given absolute power, without the inner discipline that Marcus himself had so painstakingly practiced. Commodus had a completely different starting position than his father. Marcus Aurelius had not grown up as a biological emperor's son, but as an adoptive heir who constantly had to show himself worthy. He lived for a long time in the shadow of Antoninus and learned patience, restraint, and administration. Commodus, on the other hand, was born into the purple. From his early youth he knew the idea that he was destined for the highest power. That can change a character. Those who learn power as a task may develop humility. Those who experience power as a birthright develop more easily entitlements. Marcus Aurelius knew theoretically how dangerous vanity and lust for glory were. But perhaps even he could not prevent the atmosphere of the imperial family from shaping his son differently than he would have liked. The relationship between father and son remains elusive. Marcus Aurelius was often burdened by war and government, especially on the Danube. Commodus grew up in a world in which his father was not only a father, but also an emperor, a general, and a moral role model. This closeness to such a serious and dutiful man could inspire, but also overwhelm. A son of a great ruler carries a double burden. He benefits from his father's name, but he is also constantly compared to him. Commodus was apparently later to seek completely different forms of recognition than Marcus Aurelius. While the father inwardly admonished himself to be modest, the son sought public staging. While the father bore the war as a duty, the son transformed fight and arena into personal self-expression. Marcus Aurelius nevertheless had reasons to involve Commodus. The Marcomannic Wars were not over, the empire was exhausted, and an unclear successor could have encouraged rival generals or court groups. It was particularly dangerous that successful military leaders were able to develop their own claims to power in times of crisis. Avidius Cassius had already shown in 175 how quickly usurpation could occur. When the rumor arose that Marcus Aurelius had died, Cassius had himself proclaimed emperor in the East. The uprising was quickly ended, but it was a warning signal. He showed that even under a respected emperor, loyalty was not a matter of course. If Marcus Aurelius had not had a clear dynastic successor, military rivalries might have broken out even more strongly after his death. The decision for Commodus was therefore possibly less a naive paternal love than a political risk assessment. A suitable adoptive successor would first have had to be found, built up and legitimized against the claims of the biological son. That would have required time, unity, and political calm. It was precisely this calmness that was missing. Moreover, even if Commodus had been passed over, he could have served as a dangerous center of an opposition party. An emperor's son does not simply disappear from history just because his father prefers someone else. He has a name, bloodline, followers, and symbolic weight. Excluding him might have prevented a civil war, but perhaps it would have triggered one. Nevertheless, the decision remains tragic. In retrospect, Marcus Aurelius seems to have given up with Commodus exactly what had distinguished the previous epoch: selection according to ability. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180, Commodus became the sole emperor. He made peace on the Danube and returned to Rome. For the exhausted army and many people in the Reich, this may have been a relief at first. The long wars had claimed enough victims. But it soon became apparent that Commodus had a very different idea of rule. He distanced himself from his father's dutiful ideal of government and increasingly left important decisions to his favorites. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated, his self-portrayal became more and more eccentric, and in the end he was murdered in 192. After that, the empire plunged into a serious succession crisis, the so-called Second Year of the Four Emperors, from which Septimius Severus finally emerged victorious. This development has permanently obscured the view of Marcus Aurelius' succession decision. Many historians and storytellers saw this as the great mistake of the philosopher-emperor. The man, who had constantly checked himself, had failed with his son, of all people. The ruler, who had come to power through adoption, had given up the principle of choosing the best out of fatherly love or dynastic thinking. The last good emperor opened the way for a bad emperor. This interpretation is impressive, but it is perhaps too simple. She blames Marcus Aurelius for everything Commodus did later and underestimates the constraints under which the decision was made. A fair gaze must see both. Marcus Aurelius was responsible for the elevation of his son. He made a conscious decision to build up Commodus as his successor. He could theoretically have examined other ways. At the same time, he did not act in an empty room. He was an aging emperor in an exhausted empire, surrounded by wars, epidemics, military power issues, and dynastic expectations. A biological son was a political advantage, but also a trap. Using it promised continuity. Ignoring it promised uncertainty. Marcus Aurelius opted for continuity, perhaps hoping that education, counselor, and the burden of the office would shape Commodus. The tragedy lies in the fact that Marcus Aurelius' own virtues were not hereditary. Philosophy can be taught, but it must be embraced. Self-control can be exemplified, but it does not automatically grow in the son. A sense of duty can be expected, but not forced. Marcus Aurelius had worked all his life against vanity, anger, and comfort. Commodus had to fight this inner battle himself. From what we know, he did not lead him in the same way. The father could hand over the throne to the son, but not the soul that would have been necessary to carry it well. This chapter thus touches on one of the deepest questions in history. Can a good ruler secure a good future? Marcus Aurelius' life shows that even wisdom has limits. A person can strive to act justly and still make decisions whose consequences will be severe. He can stabilize an empire and yet not prevent another character from using the force differently after him. He can love a son and hope for him as emperor at the same time, but love is no guarantee of political suitability. Commodus thus became an open wound in the legacy of Marcus Aurelius. Without him, the image of the philosopher-emperor would perhaps appear brighter, almost flawless. With him, it becomes more human and tragic. Marcus Aurelius was not the omniscient sage who recognized every danger and made every decision correctly. He was a father, an emperor, a mortal man under pressure. His succession decision does not show the end of his greatness, but the limit of his control. He was able to educate himself to reason. He was able to lead the empire through wars and epidemics. He could carry power with unusual seriousness, but he could not ensure that the man after him had the same inner attitude. Thus, at the end of Marcus Aurelius' life, Commodus stands like a dark question. Was his elevation a mistake, a necessity, or both at the same time? Perhaps it is precisely this uncertainty that is the most honest answer. Marcus Aurelius did not choose between a clearly good and a clearly bad solution. He chose between risks. He decided in favor of his son, in favor of dynastic continuity, and against the danger of an open power struggle. History later showed how expensive this election became. But the moment it was hit, it may have seemed to an aging emperor to be the surest way to save an exhausted empire from new uncertainty. The succession of Commodus reminds us that history is not only made up of ideals, but of limited people, incomplete knowledge, and decisions under pressure. Marcus Aurelius wanted to leave the empire in an orderly manner. Instead, a development began after him that many perceived as a break. Therein lies the bitter irony of his life. The emperor, who called himself so strictly to reason, could not prevent the irrationality of the future. 15. Death, legacy, and myth. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180, probably in the military camp near Vindobona, today's Vienna, or near it. What is certain above all is that his death did not happen in the peaceful seclusion of a palace, but in connection with the long wars on the Danube. This fits his life in an almost tragic way. The emperor, who sought inner peace, did not die in peace. The philosopher, who had repeatedly reflected on transience, encountered death in a world that was still marked by war, illness, and political uncertainty. His last years were not determined by withdrawal, but by duty. Until the end, he remained a ruler who did not simply think about the empire, but had to hold it together under the most difficult conditions. When Marcus Aurelius died, the Roman Empire was still outwardly powerful. Its borders had not collapsed, its legions continued to stand in the provinces, its cities continued to live, its administration functioned, and Rome remained the center of a vast political order. But beneath the surface, much had changed. The Antonine Plague had left deep marks. The wars on the Danube had shown that even Italy was no longer safe as a matter of course. The finances were strained, the army exhausted, and the northern border areas remained restless. Marcus Aurelius did not leave behind a destroyed empire, but an empire that had shown its vulnerability more clearly than before. His reign therefore marks a turning point for many observers. Not because the downfall began immediately after his death, but because he ended an era in which Rome could still see itself as a permanently stable world order. The immediate successor was Commodus, his son. This fulfilled the dynastic planning that Marcus Aurelius had prepared in his last years. Commodus had already been co-emperor and did not have to fight against other candidates for the throne. At first glance, the succession seemed to be ordered. This is exactly what Marcus Aurelius probably wanted to achieve. After decades of plague, war, and military strain, the empire was not to be shaken by an open power struggle. But the later rule of Commodus cast a long shadow over his father's legacy. For Commodus ruled differently, thought differently, staged himself differently, and increasingly distanced himself from the ideal of dutiful self-control embodied by Marcus Aurelius. It was precisely for this reason that Marcus Aurelius' death was later often interpreted as the symbolic end of a better time. The idea of the so-called good emperors, which begins with Nerva and ends with Marcus Aurelius, condenses this interpretation. In this image, these rulers stood for moderate government, careful succession, cooperation with the Senate, and a certain moral dignity of the empire. With Commodus, on the other hand, decay begins, the return of arbitrariness, personal eccentricity, and political instability. This image is effective, but it is also simplified. Roman history has never been so neatly divided into good and bad times. Even under Marcus Aurelius, there were hard wars, religious persecutions, social inequality, and serious crises. And even after him, the empire did not collapse immediately. Nevertheless, this interpretation has an emotional truth. Marcus Aurelius seemed like the last great representative of an ideal that was later remembered longingly. However, his legacy is not only in his politics. Many emperors were militarily successful, many administered the empire, many minted coins, built monuments, and waged wars. Marcus Aurelius, however, left behind something rare, an insight into the thinking of a ruler about himself. His self-reflections made him a figure that reaches far beyond Roman history. They do not show an emperor celebrating himself, but a person admonishing himself. They do not show a victor glorifying his deeds, but a man who tries daily not to be dominated by anger, vanity, fatigue, or despair. It is precisely because these thoughts were not planned as a public work that they still have such a strong effect today. They appear like notes from within power. These thoughts are a central part of his myth. Marcus Aurelius became a philosopher-emperor, a ruler who combined power and thoughtfulness in a way that was rare. The term myth is not to be understood as a lie. It means that a historical person becomes an image beyond his or her concrete time, which later generations fill with their own questions. For some, Marcus Aurelius is the ideal of the virtuous statesman. For others, he is an example of how even the best personal morality cannot cancel out the harshness of imperial politics. Still others see him as a person who, in the midst of being overwhelmed, found an inner language to carry on. His myth lives precisely because it is not unambiguous. Marcus Aurelius fascinates because he carries contradictions within himself. He was a man of philosophy, but also a warlord. He wrote about humanity, but ruled an empire based on violence and hierarchy. He strove for inner peace, but spent large parts of his late reign in a military state of emergency. He believed in duty, but that duty forced him to make decisions that caused suffering. He wanted to control himself, but could not shape his son into a second Marcus Aurelius. These contradictions do not make him smaller. They make it more historically true. An immaculate Marcus Aurelius would be just a statue. The real Marcus Aurelius was a man under pressure. His death on the Danube therefore has a special symbolic power. Rome had often portrayed its emperors as almost superhuman figures. Their images were written on coins, their names were immortalized in inscriptions, their victories were celebrated, and their deceased bodies were sometimes elevated to the rank of divine worship. But Marcus Aurelius' own philosophy destroys this exaggeration from within. He knew that emperors also die, that bodies perish, that fame fades, and that even great names will one day be little more than words. Perhaps it is precisely this attitude that made his posthumous fame so lasting. He didn't just want to appear immortal. He thought seriously about what it means to be mortal. After his death, Marcus Aurelius was deified, as was customary among respected emperors. The state honored him, his memory was cultivated, and his person became part of the Roman ruling tradition. But his actual survival happened in a different way. Not only through temples, coins, or official honors, but through the transmission of his thoughts. Centuries later, people no longer read his words because they were subjects of the Roman Empire, but because they found something human in them. A second-century emperor suddenly spoke to readers from completely different times, cultures, and worlds. Not as a commander, but as someone who fought with the same inner opponents: fear, anger, pride, grief, fatigue, impatience, and the desire to avoid the hard. However, this timeless effect should not distract from the fact that Marcus Aurelius remained firmly rooted in his time. He was not a modern person, not a democrat, not a pacifist, not a reformer in today's sense. He accepted many of the foundations of the Roman order that seem strange or unjust to us today. He was an emperor, not an outsider of power. Precisely for this reason, one should neither glorify nor condemn him without understanding his world. His greatness lies not in the fact that he stood outside his time, but in the fact that he sought moral clarity within his time. He could not resolve the contradictions of the empire, but he did not allow himself to be completely dulled by them. In political terms, his record remains mixed, but significant. He held the empire together in a phase of severe crisis. He reacted to the Parthian War, survived the devastating plague, fought long battles on the Danube, secured the borders, and preserved the authority of the empire. He did not rule in a comfortable era, but at a time when the stability of the empire was seriously shaken for the first time in a long time. The fact that Rome survived these burdens was also due to his perseverance, his sense of duty, and his ability to continue the government despite personal exhaustion. He was not a conqueror like Trajan, not a great builder like Hadrian, not a pure emperor of peace like Antoninus Pius. He was the emperor of the endurance test. Morally, his legacy remains even more complex. He shows that good rule does not end with good intentions, but only begins there. A ruler must examine himself, because power can damage the soul. He must remember that opponents are also human beings, even if he fights them. He must know that anger often appears as a strength, but in reality corrupts the power of judgment. He must understand that fame is an uncertain wage and that duty must not depend on applause. These thoughts are not only important for Kaiser. They appeal to everyone who bears responsibility, whether in a state, a family, a profession, or in their own life. Perhaps that is why Marcus Aurelius is still so present today. He does not offer a simple heroic figure, but a serious question. How do you stay decent when you're tired? How do you act justly when the circumstances are harsh? How do you maintain peace of mind when the world is restless? How do you accept boundaries without becoming inactive? How do you take responsibility without losing yourself? These questions make him modern, even though his world is long gone. At the end of his life, there was no complete triumph. The wars were not finally resolved, the succession was risky, the wounds of the plague remained, and the empire would soon take a different path under Commodus. But perhaps a smooth triumph would not have been suitable for Marcus Aurelius either. His life was not a fairy tale about the perfectly wise ruler. It was the story of a man who, under the weight of power, tried to remain true to himself. He didn't fail completely, but he didn't solve everything either. He persevered. And this perseverance, combined with the constant work on his own character, became his real legacy. Marcus Aurelius died as emperor, but he survived as a voice. Not as a loud voice of command, but as a quiet voice of self-examination. His empire is gone, his camps have disappeared, the Danube border has lost its ancient significance, and the political struggles of his time belong to history. But his question remains. What does a person do with the power that is given to him? Does he use it for vanity, for cruelty, for fleeing from himself? Or does he try to bear them with moderation, reason, and responsibility? In this question lies the lasting significance of Marcus Aurelius. He was not perfect, but he knew that a person must strive for perfection precisely because he never fully achieves it. He was powerful, but he knew that power becomes small before death. He was emperor, but he never quite forgot that he was first and foremost a man. And perhaps this is precisely the reason why his name is not only in history books to this day, but lives on in the thoughts of all those who are looking for a stance in difficult times.